The gavel struck with finality, its sharp crack silencing the murmurs that rippled through the Cedar Creek courthouse. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. The room smelled of polished sweat and judgment. Dr. Samuel Thorne stood before the bench, shoulders squared despite the weight that had settled there years ago. His hands, surgeon's hands that had once been steady as stone, hung at his sides, the left one twitching almost imperceptibly. The blue of his eyes had faded like well-washed denim, but they remained clear and direct as he faced Judge Howard. "These children," the judge said, each word measured and heavy. "Who do they belong to, Dr. Thorne?" Behind Samuel on the third bench sat two small figures. The older girl, Emma, sat with her spine-rigid chin tilted up in a gesture that wasn't pride but something harder, survival. Beside her, tiny Lily clutched a tattered rag doll, her eyes wide and unblinking beneath a tangle of honey-colored curls. Samuel's gaze never left the judge. "They belong to me," he answered, his voice rough-edged but unwavering. "Not because I purchased them, Your Honor." He paused, the words forming carefully. "But because they chose me wise." Judge Howard's bushy eyebrows drew together. The courtroom held its breath. Samuel continued, something flickering in his eyes that hadn't been there for years. "And I chose them." The judge leaned forward, fingers steepled. "That's not how the law works, Doctor." "Perhaps not," Samuel conceded, "but it's how the heart works." The room blurred, sounds fading like water rushing over rocks, and the scene dissolved into memory. 3 months early, spring had come late to Cedar Creek, Nebraska in 1807. The last remnants of winter clung stubbornly to the shadows, even as purple crocuses pushed through the softening earth. The town itself seemed reluctant to shake off its hibernation. Buildings, weathered by harsh winters, stood shoulder to shoulder along the main street, their facades just beginning to brighten under a tentative sun. Cedar Creek had never quite recovered from the war. 12 years had passed since Appomattox, but the wounds remained visible in the missing limbs of veterans who gathered outside the general store, in the black dresses of widows who still outnumbered those in color, in the hushed conversations that fell silent when certain names were mentioned. On this particular Thursday, the town square bustled with unusual activity. A makeshift platform had been erected before the courthouse steps, rough-hewn planks, supported by barrels, a crude auction block under the open sky. A small crowd had gathered, their expressions ranging from curiosity to grim determination. Most were men farmers by the look of them, hands calloused and faces wind-chapped. A few women stood at the edges, clutching reticules and exchanging whispers behind gloved hands. Dr. Samuel Thorne had not intended to witness any of this. His visits to town had grown increasingly rare over the past 5 years, limited to necessary errands when his supplies dwindled beyond improvisation. He had come for laudanum and catgut sutures, nothing more. The leather satchel in his hand contained the medicinal herbs he still gathered, himself echinacea, willow bark, yarrow, but some things couldn't be foraged from the woods surrounding his cabin. Samuel moved through town like a ghost, familiar, yet apart. At 45, he was neither young nor old, but something in between that couldn't be measured in years. His dark hair had silvered at the temples, and deep lines bracketed a mouth that rarely smiled. He wore a simple gray coat, well made, but showing signs of age much like its owner. Most people nodded respectfully as he passed. He had set too many broken bones and delivered too many babies to be ignored, but few attempted conversation. The doctor's reticence had become legendary, a wall built of grief and silence that few tried to scale anymore. Samuel was nearly at Henderson's pharmacy when the crowd's movement caught his attention. A wagon had pulled up to the auction block, its wooden sides too high to see what cargo it carried. A sharp-faced woman in a cornflower blue bonnet climbed down from the driver's seat, followed by a portly man in a rumpled suit who immediately began addressing the gathering. "Folks of Cedar Creek," the man called, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of an auctioneer, "we've got some fine opportunities today for those of you in need of extra hands around your properties." Samuel slowed his pace. Something in the man's tone raised the hairs on his neck. The woman in the blue bonnet lowered the wagon's back gate with a clatter. She reached inside, and when her hands emerged, they were grasping the arm of a child. A girl no more than 5 years old blinked in the sudden brightness. Her dress had once been green, now faded to the uncertain color of pond water. Her hair hung in matted tangles, the shade of wheat, and though her face was smudged with dirt, her eyes blazed with a fierce, desperate dignity. She didn't step down so much as she was pulled, stumbling slightly before catching herself. The woman reached in again, this time extracting a smaller child, another girl perhaps 3, wearing what had once been a pink dress. Unlike her companion, this child was crying silently, tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on her round cheeks. She wore no shoes and her tiny feet were nearly black with dirt. Samuel's hand tightened on his satchel. An orphan auction. He had heard of them, of course, but had never witnessed one. Children left parentless by war, disease, or destitution, sold to the highest bidder for labor or companionship or God knows what else. All perfectly legal, wrapped in the thin veneer of adoption fees and placement services. He should turn away. This was not his concern. His own wounds were still too raw, his failures too numerous to count. And yet his feet wouldn't move. First lot, the auctioneer announced, gesturing to the girls. 2 healthy females, no visible disease or deformity. The older ones got some spirit, but strong arms for carrying. Younger ones quiet, good for keeping around the house without much fuss. The older girl stood still as stone, but her eyes darted across the crowd like a cornered animal's. The little one clung to her sister's dress, face pressed against the fabric. Starting bid at $15 for the pair, the auctioneer called. Or we can separate if there's interest. A burly man near the front raised his hand. I'll give 10 for just the big one. Need someone to scrub floors, not interested in the little crier. The older girl's arm went around her sister's shoulders, pulling her closer. Very good, sir, the auctioneer nodded. $10 bid for the older girl. Do I hear 15 for the pair? No one moved. Samuel felt something tighten in his chest, a pressure he hadn't felt in years. Well then, the auctioneer continued, the younger girl separately. Who will start at $8? She's not ready, the older girl said suddenly, her voice startlingly clear in the morning air. She's only 3. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the crowd. The woman in the blue bonnet stepped forward, pinching the older girl's arm. Hush now, she hissed. No one asked you. She stays with me, the girl insisted, gripping her sister's wrist. Her voice didn't waver, though her bottom lip trembled slightly. The burly man who had bid stepped closer to the platform. Girl's got a mouth on her, he observed not unpleasantly. I can fix that quick enough. Don't take her, the older girl repeated, pulling her sister behind her. She's only 3. Something shifted in the air, a collective discomfort. Some people looked away. Others watched with the detached fascination of those witnessing a storm from safe shelter. And in that moment, and as Samuel looked at the older girl's desperate, determined face, he saw something that stopped his breath. Her eyes, blue with flecks of gold near the pupil, unusual and striking, were exactly like Martha's. Martha, whose absence still echoed through his empty cabin 5 years after her death. Martha, who had died bringing their daughter into a world that hadn't kept her either. Martha, whose last whispered words had been, "Find love again, Sam." Before Samuel knew what he was doing, he had stepped forward. The crowd parted for him, perhaps recognizing something in his face that warned against interference. He didn't speak as he approached the platform. He simply reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch. The coins inside clinked softly as he tossed it at the auctioneer's feet. That's $50, Samuel said, his voice rusty from disuse. For both girls. The auctioneer stared, clearly surprised by this intervention from the town's reclusive doctor. Well, that's more than fair, Samuel cut him off. He turned to the girls, his eyes softening slightly. Without asking permission, he knelt and gathered the little one into his arms. She didn't fight, just pressed her tear-stained face against his shoulder, her tiny body trembling. Sir, the woman in the blue bonnet began, her thin lips pinched in disapproval. There are papers to sign, procedures. Send them to my cabin, Samuel said, not looking at her. He held out his free hand to the older girl, who stared at it as if it might be a trap. Come along, he said more gently than he'd spoken to anyone in years. She didn't take his hand, but she stepped down from the platform on her own and stood beside him, her eyes never leaving her sister. What's your name? Samuel asked her quietly as they began to walk away, the crowd's murmurs growing behind them. Emma, she answered, her voice barely audible. That's Lily, Samuel nodded once. I'm Dr. Thorne. You can call me Samuel. They walked in silence through the town, past the curious stares and whispered comments. Lily had gone limp in Samuel's arms, exhaustion overtaking fear. Emma walked with her head high, though Samuel noticed she stayed just slightly behind him, as if ready to run if necessary. It was nearly a mile to his cabin, which stood alone at the edge of a pine forest far enough from town to afford privacy, but close enough to be summoned for medical emergencies. The path was well-worn but narrow, winding through scrubby grassland before climbing a gentle slope. As they crested the hill, Samuel's home came into view. It wasn't large, but it had been built with care, a solid log structure with a wide porch and a stone chimney from which a thin plume of smoke still rose. A small barn stood nearby, housing his horse and a milk cow. Beyond that, a vegetable garden waited for warmer days, the turned earth rich and dark. Emma stopped at the sight of it, her eyes widening slightly. "Is this where you live?" Samuel nodded, shifting Lily's weight in his arms. "It is." "All alone?" Something flickered in his eyes. "Yes, all alone." The inside of the cabin was clean but sparse. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a kettle hanging from an iron arm above banked coals. A wooden table with two chairs stood in the center, a single plate and cup still waiting to be washed. A rocking chair faced the fire, a book open on its seat. Against the far wall was a bed neatly made with a patchwork quilt. A ladder led to a small loft above. Most striking, perhaps, was what hung on a peg near the door, a woman's blue woolen coat preserved as if its owner might return at any moment to claim it. Samuel laid Lily gently on the bed, removing her threadbare shoes. The child curled into herself, thumb finding its way to her mouth. He turned to find Emma standing in the doorway, her eyes darting from the coat to the single plate to his face. "Are you hungry?" he asked. She nodded slowly. He moved to the hearth, stirring the coals and adding a log. From a pot hanging on the wall, he ladled stew into a bowl and placed it on the table. "Sit," he said, pulling out a chair. Emma approached cautiously, as if expecting the food to be snatched away. When she finally sat, she ate with the controlled desperation of a child who had known hunger, not too fast, but without pausing, her eyes occasionally darting to her sleeping sister. Samuel sat across from her, watching. There were questions he should ask, information he should gather, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he found himself studying the girl's face, searching for what? A resemblance to someone, a sign. "Why did you buy us?" Emma asked suddenly, her spoon pausing halfway to her mouth. The directness of the question startled him. "I didn't buy you," he said after a moment. "I paid so you wouldn't be sold." She considered this, her young face solemn. "What do you want us to do? For work?" "The lady said we could carry buckets or mind a porch." Something cold settled in Samuel's stomach. "You don't need to work here," he said. "You need to rest and eat." And he trailed off, unsure what came next. Emma's eyes narrowed slightly, suspicion clear in her gaze. "Everyone wants something," she said with a weariness no child should possess. Samuel stood abruptly and walked to the window. Outside, spring twilight was settling over the pines, the sky deepening to purple. He thought of Martha, of the daughter they had lost, of the life he had imagined, and the one he had instead. "I want," he said finally, his back still to Emma, "for you both to be safe." When he turned, the girl was watching him with those eyes, Martha's eyes, but the suspicion had softened slightly. She glanced at her sister, then back to him. "She has bad dreams," she said. "Wakes up crying for Mama." Samuel nodded. "I understand. Mama's gone. Lily doesn't understand yet, but I do." "Where is your mother?" he asked gently. Emma's face closed like a door. "They said she left, went west without us." Her tone made it clear she didn't believe this. "And your father, Ton, died in the war. I don't remember him." Samuel felt a pang of recognition. How many men had he watched die during those 4 bloody years? How many had murmured final words about wives and children waiting at home? "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. Emma finished her stew in silence. When the bowl was empty, she looked toward the loft. "Do we sleep up there?" "No," Samuel said. "You and Lily take the bed. I'll sleep in the chair tonight, and tomorrow I'll make pallets for all of us." She frowned. "We can't take your bed." "You're not taking it. I'm giving it to you." He softened his voice. "Just for tonight, Emma. We'll sort things out in the morning." She seemed to weigh his words for truthfulness, then nodded once. "Thank you," she said formally, as if reciting a lesson. After checking on Lily, who still slept deeply, Emma crawled onto the bed beside her sister. She didn't remove her dress or shoes, and she positioned herself between Lily and the room, a small barrier against whatever might come in the night. Samuel added another log to the fire, then settled into the rocking chair with a blanket. Sleep wouldn't come easily, it rarely did, but tonight there was a different quality to his wakefulness. The cabin so long silent except for the crackle of fire and the occasional creak of settling logs now contained the soft breathing of children. He watched the flames dance, thinking of Martha's eyes in a stranger's face, of promises unkept, of the curious turns life took when you least expected them. Eventually his eyes grew heavy, and for the first time in many months, Samuel Thorne slept without dreams. Morning came gently, the first rays of sun filtering through pine branches to dapple the cabin floor. Samuel woke with a stiff neck and the momentary disorientation of someone who has slept in an unfamiliar position. The events of the previous day rushed back as his gaze fell on the bed where two small forms lay tangled in the quilt. He rose quietly, stretching to ease the ache in his back. The fire had died to embers overnight, and the cabin held the chill of early spring. Moving silently, he stoked the coals and added kindling, coaxing the flames back to life. A soft sound made him turn. Emma was awake, watching him with those disconcerting eyes. She lay completely still, one arm protectively around her sister, who still slept deeply. "Good morning," Samuel said, keeping his voice low. Emma didn't reply, but her gaze followed him as he moved about the cabin, setting water to boil and taking down a tin of coffee from a shelf. "Are you hungry?" he asked. She nodded once. "I'll make breakfast after I've tended to the animals. You can stay inside if you'd like." Another nod, less certain. Samuel pulled on his coat and boots and stepped outside into the crisp morning air. The routine was familiar, checking on the horse, milking the cow, gathering eggs from the 3 hens that scratched in a small pen. But today each task felt different, charged with a new awareness of the life that had unexpectedly entered his own. When he returned with a pail of milk and a basket of eggs, he found both girls awake. Lily sat on the edge of the bed, her small feet dangling above the floor. Her face was tear-stained, but she wasn't crying now, just watching her sister with huge, solemn eyes. Emma had found a broom and was sweeping the floor with methodical strokes. "You don't need to do that," Samuel said, setting down his burdens. Emma didn't stop. "We earn our keep," she said with the air of someone repeating a phrase often heard. "Not here," Samuel replied firmly. He crossed to her and gently took the broom. "Here are your guests." She looked up at him, confusion clear on her small face. "For how long?" The question hung in the air between them. Samuel hadn't thought beyond the impulse that had driven him to intervene at the auction. What was his plan? What responsibility had he taken on? "For as long as you need," he said finally. It wasn't really an answer, but it was the only one he had. Breakfast was a simple affair. Fried eggs, cornbread, left from the previous day, and fresh milk. Lily ate little, pushing food around her plate, but Emma consumed everything offered with the same careful efficiency she had shown at dinner. As they ate, Samuel studied the girls in the clear morning light. Their condition was worse than he had initially assessed. Both were thin, their wrists and ankles bird-like. Emma's hair, though tangled, showed signs of having been neatly braided not long ago. Lily's curls were matted in places, and a healing scratch ran along one cheek. Both had the pallid complexion of children who had spent too long indoors, and their clothing was worn beyond the point of mere shabbiness. "After breakfast," Samuel said, "I'll heat water for baths, and we'll need to see about some new clothes." Emma's hand paused halfway to her mouth. "We don't have any others." "I know. We'll make do today, and tomorrow I'll go back to town." Her eyes widened slightly. "You're going to take us back?" "No," Samuel said quickly, surprised by the vehemence in his own voice. "No, I'll go alone. To buy what you need." The relief on Emma's face was painful to witness. What had these children endured that made them so fearful of return? After breakfast, Samuel hauled water from the well and set it to heat in a large copper tub he dragged in from the porch. While it warmed, he rummaged through a trunk at the foot of his bed, eventually producing 2 nightshirts that had once been his. "They'll be too big," he explained to Emma, "but clean. We can wash your dresses and dry them by the fire." When the water was ready, he showed Emma how to use the privacy screen that folded out beside the fire, then tactfully busied himself outside while the girls bathed. He chopped wood more than was needed, the rhythm of the axe a comfort in its familiarity. His mind wandered as he worked. What had possessed him to take these children? Was it just the echo of Martha in Emma's eyes? Or something else, a loneliness he hadn't admitted even to himself, a void that had grown larger with each passing season? Whatever it was, he had acted, and now 2 lives were temporarily in his hands. It was a responsibility he hadn't sought, but one he couldn't ignore now that it had found him. When he returned to the cabin, he found both girls dressed in his oversized nightshirts, their wet hair combed back from faces that looked younger now that the dirt was gone. Their dresses hung on a line strung near the fire, dripping occasionally onto the stones below. "Better?" he asked, setting down the armload of wood. Emma nodded, one hand absently stroking Lily's damp curls. The younger girl sat beside her sister on the hearthrug, a picture book open on her lap, one of Martha's preserved like everything else that had been hers. Samuel watched them for a moment, struck by how quickly they had adapted to this strange situation, how readily children could accept new circumstances when given no choice. It humbled him, this resilience. "I need to check my supplies," he said, more to break the silence than from necessity. "I'm the town's doctor." Emma's eyes widened slightly. "A real doctor, with medicines?" "Yes." He moved to a cabinet beside the fireplace and opened it, revealing rows of neatly labeled bottles and jars. "I treat people when they're ill or injured." "Can you fix anything?" Lily asked suddenly, her voice so unexpected that both Samuel and Emma turned to stare. It was high and sweet, with the slight lisp of early childhood. Samuel recovered first. "Not anything," he answered seriously, "but many things." Lily nodded as if this confirmed something important, then returned her attention to the book, small fingers tracing the illustrations. Emma watched her sister with barely disguised relief, then looked back at Samuel. "She doesn't talk much," she explained in a low voice. "Not since Mama left." There was that hesitation again, that doubt about their mother's departure. Samuel made a mental note to inquire about the circumstances later when Lily wasn't present. The rest of the day passed in a kind of tentative harmony. Samuel showed the girls around the cabin and its surroundings, explaining the boundaries of where they could safely play. Emma listened attentively, asking practical questions about the well, the outhouse, the garden. Lily followed silently, one hand always clutching her sister's nightshirt, the other occasionally reaching out to touch things: a wildflower, the rough bark of a pine, the soft nose of the cow who regarded her with liquid brown eyes. By evening, a routine of sorts had established itself. Samuel prepared a simple supper, which they ate at the table now set for three. Afterward, while he washed the dishes, Emma helped Lily into bed, their dresses now dry and folded neatly on a nearby chair. When both girls were settled under the quilt, Samuel sat in the rocking chair with a book, intending to read until they fell asleep. It was what he had done for years, reading late into the night to avoid the dreams that came with deeper sleep. "Will you tell us a story?" Emma asked, her voice uncertain, as if expecting refusal. Samuel looked up, surprised. "I don't know many stories," he admitted. "Mama used to tell us about a princess who lived in a forest." Lily murmured, her eyes already heavy with sleep. Samuel closed his book. "I don't know that one," he said, "but I could tell you about the stars. Would you like that?" Both girls nodded, Lily's movements slow and drowsy. "Well," Samuel began, his voice finding a gentler cadence than it had used in years. "When I was a boy on my father's farm in Pennsylvania, I used to lie in the fields on summer nights and look up at the stars. My father taught me their names and the patterns they make." He spoke of constellations and the myths behind them, of how sailors navigated by the North Star, of how the patterns change with the seasons. He wasn't sure if his words made sense to such young listeners, but the sound seemed to soothe them. Lily's eyes closed first, her breathing deepening into sleep. Emma fought longer, clearly determined to hear the end of his improvised tale, but eventually she too succumbed. Samuel continued, rocking gently, watching the firelight play across their sleeping faces. In repose, they looked impossibly young and vulnerable. Emma's fierce protectiveness gave way to the child she actually was, her face softened in dreams. Lily curled toward her sister like a small comma, one thumb near her mouth. Something twisted in Samuel's chest, not the sharp pain of grief that had been his companion for so long, but a different ache. These children needed protection, stability, care. Things he wasn't sure he could provide, damaged as he was. And yet, watching them sleep in the golden light of his fire, he felt a certainty that he hadn't experienced since the war. They belonged here, these lost girls. Not because he had paid money at an auction block, but because something larger than coincidence had brought them to his door. "I don't know if I can do this, Martha," he whispered to the empty air. "But I'm going to try." Outside, the wind stirred the pines, their ancient voices whispering secrets only they understood. Inside, the fire crackled, sparks ascending like prayers. And somewhere between those sounds and the quiet breathing of children found, and a man beginning to be found, something new took root and began to grow. The first week passed in a blur of adjustments and discoveries. Samuel converted the loft into a sleeping area for the girls, constructing a small ladder with wide, safe rungs for Lily's tiny feet. He hung a curtain for privacy and placed a lamp on a high shelf where it would cast a gentle glow without risk of fire. Emma approached each new development with cautious acceptance, as if waiting for the other shoe to drop. Lily remained largely silent, speaking only to her sister and occasionally to Samuel when a question couldn't be avoided. But there were small signs of thawing Lily's hand reaching for his when they walked to the chicken coop, Emma's surprised laugh when he made pancakes in the shape of animals. On the third day, Samuel rode into town for supplies. The list in his pocket was longer than any he'd made in years: fabric for dresses, ready-made shoes, ribbons for hair, a small doll for Lily, pencils, and a tablet for Emma, who had mentioned wanting to practice her letters. Cedar Creek regarded him with undisguised curiosity as he moved from store to store. News of his impulsive action at the orphan auction had spread quickly, growing more elaborate with each telling. By the time he entered Henderson's dry goods, the speculation was palpable in the glances cast his way. "Dr. Thorne," Mrs. Henderson greeted him, her voice warm but her eyes sharp with interest. "What a pleasant surprise to see you twice in 1 week." Samuel nodded politely, placing his list on the counter. "I need these items, please." Mrs. Henderson scanned the list, her eyebrows rising slightly. "Well now, this is quite a change from your usual order. Doing some charity work, are we?" "The items, Mrs. Henderson," Samuel repeated, his tone making it clear he wouldn't be drawn into gossip. She sniffed but began gathering the requested goods. "Heard you took in those auction children," she said as she measured fabric. "Very Christian of you, I'm sure, though most would have thought twice about 2 girls in a bachelor living arrangement." Samuel said nothing, but his jaw tightened perceptibly. "The older one has a look about her," Mrs. Henderson continued, undeterred by his silence. "Too knowing, if you ask me. The little one's sweet enough, though they say she's simple, what with not talking much." "She's not simple," Samuel said, the words escaping before he could stop them. "She's grieving." Mrs. Henderson's hands stilled on the bolt of calico. "Grieving what, exactly? Those children were abandoned by their mother, from what I heard. Ran off with a traveling salesman or some such." Samuel met her gaze directly. "Children grieve what they have lost, Mrs. Henderson, whether it was taken or given away. Now, if you could finish with my order, I'd be obliged." The rest of the transaction proceeded in strained silence. As Samuel gathered his packages, the bell above the door jingled, announcing another customer. He turned to find himself face to face with Reverend Jacob Whitman. The two men froze momentarily, a recognition dawning in both faces. They hadn't spoken in over a year, though Cedar Creek was small enough that complete avoidance was impossible. "Samuel," Jacob said, recovering first, "good to see you in town." Samuel nodded stiffly. "Jacob." The use of first names wasn't lost on Mrs. Henderson, whose eyes darted between them with renewed interest. Everyone knew the doctor attended no church, had no close friends in town. Yet here was the Presbyterian minister addressing him with familiar ease. "I heard about your guests," Jacob said, choosing his words carefully. "I'd like to stop by if that would be acceptable, to welcome them to our community." Something flashed in Samuel's eyes, wariness perhaps, or an older emotion. "They're still settling in," he said. "Perhaps another time." Jacob's expression revealed nothing, but his next words were pitched low for Samuel's ears alone. "We should talk, Sam, about what you've taken on." "I know what I've done," Samuel replied, equally quiet. "Do you?" Jacob held his gaze. "Do you really?" The question hung between them, weighted with history. Samuel broke eye contact first, gathering his packages. "Good day, Jacob," he said, and stepped around the minister and out into the spring sunshine. The ride home was tense, his thoughts circling like vultures over carrion. What had he done truly? Saved 2 children from God knows what, fate, yes. But brought them into what? A home, haunted by grief, presided over by a man who could barely care for himself some days. And now Jacob wanted to talk. Jacob, who knew more about Samuel's wartime experiences than anyone in Cedar Creek. Jacob, who had seen him at his worst and his best. Jacob, who had stood beside him at Martha's funeral, speaking words of comfort that had bounced off Samuel's armor of grief like pebbles off steel. By the time he reached the cabin, the sun was low in the western sky, painting the pines in gold. He dismounted slowly, his mood dark enough that he almost missed the small figure waiting on the porch steps. Emma sat with her arms wrapped around her knees, watching his approach with an intensity that reminded him of battlefield sentries. When she saw him, she stood quickly, brushing off her dress with nervous hands. "You came back," she said, and something in those three simple words pierced straight through Samuel's brooding. "Of course I did," he replied, securing the horse's reins to the hitching post. "This is my home." She nodded, but her relief was visible in the loosening of her shoulders. Lily was worried, she said, though Samuel suspected the concern had been mutual. "Well, you can tell her I'm back, and I've brought things for both of you." He began unloading his packages, passing several to Emma. "Let's go inside, it's getting cold." The cabin welcomed them with warm air and the scent of something cooking. Samuel paused in the doorway, momentarily disoriented. A pot bubbled on the hearth and the table was set neatly for three. "I made stew," Emma said behind him, her voice uncertain. "Like you showed me yesterday." Lily helped Daddy cut the carrots. Samuel turned to look at her, this child who had cooked dinner while fearing he might never return, who had learned to expect abandonment as her due, who still managed somehow to hope. "Thank you," he said, and the words felt inadequate for the emotion rising in his throat. "It smells wonderful." Her smile, quick and shy, was like sunlight breaking through clouds. The evening that followed was the most peaceful Samuel had known in years. They ate the stew, which was surprisingly good, and afterward he presented the girls with their new possessions. Lily's face when she saw the doll, a simple cloth creation with yarn hair and embroidered features, transformed with a joy so pure it was almost painful to witness. Emma ran her fingers over the tablet and pencils with reverence, as if they were made of gold instead of wood and lead. Later, as Samuel sat in his rocking chair reading medical journals, while the girls played quietly by the fire, a knock came at the door. Emma's head snapped up, her body tensing visibly. Lily scrambled closer to her sister, the new doll clutched to her chest. "It's all right," Samuel said, rising. "Probably just a neighbor." Though he had no neighbors close enough for casual visits and medical emergencies rarely presented with such polite knocking. He opened the door to find Jacob Whitman standing on the porch, hat in hand. Behind him, a buggy waited in the deepening twilight. "Evening, Samuel," Jacob said. "I hope I'm not intruding." Samuel's first instinct was to send him away to protect the fragile peace of the evening. But there was something in Jacob's expression, an earnestness, a concern that gave him pause. "The girls are getting ready for bed," he said. Which wasn't true, but would be soon enough, Jacob nodded. "I won't stay long. I just wanted to see how you were all settling in." Samuel hesitated, then stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in, then." Jacob entered, removing his hat and coat with the easy manners of a man accustomed to making himself welcome. He was a few years younger than Samuel, with the robust health of someone who had observed the war rather than participated in it. His brown hair was neatly trimmed, his collar crisp, despite the dusty ride. "Reverend Whitman," Samuel said formally, turning to the girls. "These are Emma and Lily." Emma had risen to her feet, standing protectively in front of her sister. She offered a small curtsy, clearly trained in basic manners. "Sir," she acknowledged. Jacob smiled warmly. "It's a pleasure to meet you both. I'm the minister at the Presbyterian church in town." He looked around the cabin, his gaze lingering briefly on Martha's coat still hanging by the door. "You have a nice home here." "Thank you," Emma replied automatically, though her expression remained wary. "I brought something for you." Jacob continued, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew two small wrapped objects and held them out. "A welcome gift." Emma looked to Samuel, who nodded slightly. She approached cautiously and accepted the packages, bringing them back to Lily. Together they unwrapped what proved to be two small wooden crosses on leather cords. "They're very nice," Emma said politely, though her lack of enthusiasm was evident. Jacob didn't seem offended. "Your mother might have taught you prayers," he said gently. "If you'd like, I could—" "Mama sang to us," Lily interrupted unexpectedly, "at bedtime." Jacob's smile widened at this success in engaging the younger girl. "Songs are prayers too, in their way," he said. "Perhaps you could teach me one sometime." Lily ducked her head, retreating into silence again. Samuel cleared his throat. "It's getting late," he said with a pointed look at Jacob. "The girls need their rest." "Of course," Jacob turned to Emma and Lily. "It was lovely to meet you both. I hope I'll see you again soon." Emma nodded, still clutching the crosses with uncertainty. "I'll walk you out," Samuel said, already moving toward the door. Outside, the night had fully descended, stars pricking the velvet darkness above the pines. Jacob waited until they were several paces from the cabin before speaking. "They seem well," he observed. "Cautious, but that's to be expected." Samuel made a non-committal sound. "The town's talking, Sam," Jacob continued, his tone shifting to something more serious. "About you and the girls." "The town always talks," Samuel replied. "I've never cared before. This is different. Two young girls living with a bachelor, especially one who's—" Jacob hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Known to have suffered. It raises questions." Samuel stopped walking, turning to face the minister. "What are you suggesting, Jacob?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Jacob said quickly. "I'm reporting what others are saying. Victoria Reed has been particularly vocal." The name sent a chill through Samuel. Victoria Reed, widow of Colonel Reed, was one of Cedar Creek's most influential citizens and one of its most judgmental. Her position as head of the church board gave her a platform for her opinions, which were rarely charitable and never challenged. "What business is it of hers?" "She's concerned about the children's moral welfare," Jacob said, though his tone suggested he found the concern excessive. "And she has connections to the orphanage those girls came from." Samuel's eyes narrowed. "What kind of connections?" "She's on their board of directors. Has been for years." Jacob sighed, his breath clouding in the cool night air. "Look, Sam, I'm not here as her messenger. I'm here as your friend, or at least as close to one as you've allowed anyone to be since Martha died." The mention of his wife's name still had the power to make Samuel flinch. "Those girls need stability," Jacob continued. "Security. I'm not questioning your intentions, but your situation. It's unusual, and in small towns, unusual rarely goes unchallenged. What would you have me do? Send them back to be sold to the highest bidder?" "Of course not," Jacob said firmly. "But there are proper channels. Legal adoption, guardianship papers, things that would protect both them and you from speculation." Samuel hadn't considered the legal aspects. In the moment at the auction block, he had acted on instinct, not reason. Now, looking back at the lighted windows of his cabin, he realized how precarious their situation might be. "I'll look into it," he said finally. Jacob nodded, seemingly satisfied with this concession. "Good." He hesitated, then added, "And Sam, maybe consider bringing them to church. It would help quiet some of the talk." Samuel's expression hardened. "I don't use church as a social tool, Jacob. You know that." "I do," the minister acknowledged, "but sometimes we do things for others that we wouldn't do for ourselves." He gestured toward the cabin. "You've already started down that path, haven't you?" There was no arguing with that observation. Samuel had indeed stepped outside his carefully constructed isolation, drawn by the desperate courage in a child's eyes. "I'll think about it," he said, which wasn't quite a promise, but wasn't a refusal either. Jacob accepted this with a nod. "That's all I ask." He extended his hand. "It's good to see you, Sam, despite the circumstances." After a moment's hesitation, Samuel took the offered hand. "Good night, Jacob." He watched the buggy until it disappeared down the winding path, then turned back to the cabin. Through the window, he could see Emma and Lily sitting by the fire, their heads bent over something, the doll perhaps, or the crosses Jacob had brought. A wave of protectiveness washed over him, surprising in its intensity. These children, so recently strangers, had somehow become his responsibility. His to shield from judgment, from harm, from the very abandonment they so clearly feared. Legal adoption. The thought hadn't occurred to him before Jacob mentioned it. Was that what he wanted? To officially, permanently become these girls' guardian? To commit himself to raising them to adulthood? The questions followed him back into the cabin, where Emma looked up with that same watchful gaze. "Is everything all right?" she asked, wise beyond her years. Samuel nodded, closing the door behind him. "Yes," he said, "everything's fine." It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false either. There were clouds gathering on the horizon, Victoria Reed's disapproval, the town's speculation, the legal uncertainties of their arrangement. But here in this moment, in the warm circle of firelight, with two children who had begun to trust him, everything was indeed all right. And for now, that would have to be enough. The following day dawned clear and warm, a perfect Nebraska spring morning. Samuel rose early, as was his habit, and stepped outside to watch the sunrise. The air was fresh with dew and pine, And somewhere in the distance, a mourning dove called softly to its mate. His conversation with Jacob had left him unsettled, though he was reluctant to admit it. The minister's warnings about Victoria Reed and the town's gossip weren't surprising. Samuel had lived in Cedar Creek long enough to know how quickly judgment could spread through its streets. But the suggestion that the girls might be taken from him, returned to the orphanage, or placed elsewhere had lodged in his mind like a splinter. He was still standing on the porch, lost in thought, when the door opened behind him. Emma slipped out, her hair loose around her shoulders, feet bare despite the morning chill. "You're up early," Samuel observed. She nodded, coming to stand beside him at the railing. "I always wake up when the birds start." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the sun's rays stretch across the meadow beyond the cabin. "That man who came last night," Emma said finally, "is he your friend?" Samuel considered the question. He was once, during the war. "Was he a doctor too?" "No, he was a chaplain, a minister for the soldiers." Emma digested this. "Did he help you fix people?" The innocence of the question almost made Samuel smile. "In his way," he answered. "I tried to heal their bodies. He tried to heal their spirits." "Which is harder?" This time Samuel did smile, a brief upward quirk of his lips. "Both are difficult in their own way." Emma nodded, as if this confirmed something she had suspected. "Is he going to help us stay here?" The directness of the question caught Samuel off guard. "What makes you ask that?" She shrugged, a too-adult gesture on her small frame. "You were talking about us. I could tell." "Yet you're very observant," Samuel said, not bothering to deny it. "You have to be in the orphanage." There was no self-pity in her tone, just a matter-of-fact acknowledgement. Samuel turned to face her fully. "Emma, I want you to know something." He knelt down to her level, meeting those eyes that still unsettled him with their familiar hue. "As long as I have any say in the matter, you and Lily will stay here. With me." Her expression didn't change, but something flickered in her gaze, hope perhaps quickly guarded. "For how long?" "For as long as you need a home." She studied his face with an intensity that belied her years searching for deception or uncertainty. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, because she nodded once decisively. "All right," she said, and turned back to watch the sunrise. Samuel remained kneeling for a moment longer, struck by the strange solemnity of the exchange. It felt like a contract had been signed, a promise made that could not be broken without grave consequences. The moment was interrupted by a sound from inside the cabin, Lily calling for her sister. "I should go to her," Emma said, already moving toward the door. "She gets scared when she wakes up alone." Samuel nodded, rising to his feet. "I'll start breakfast." The morning routine had already established itself with surprising ease: breakfast chores, then lessons. Samuel had discovered that Emma could read simple words but struggled with longer ones, while Lily knew by her letters but couldn't yet connect them into words. He had begun teaching them each day, using the few children's books that remained from his own childhood. Today, however, as they finished their oatmeal, Samuel proposed something different. "I thought we might ride into town today," he said casually. "All of us." Emma's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. "Why, but to get material for your new dresses, Mrs. Henderson can take your measurements properly." The real reason was more complex. After his conversation with Jacob, Samuel had decided it was time to investigate the legal aspects of the girl's situation. That would require a visit to the county clerk's office. And pragmatically, he needed to introduce the girls to Cedar Creek, eventually better to do it on his terms than have curiosity seekers finding excuses to visit the cabin. Emma looked at Lily, who had gone very still. "We don't want to go back," she said, her voice tight. "Not to the orphanage," Samuel clarified quickly. "Just to town, to the stores, and we'll come home afterward." Lily's small hand crept across the table to clutch her sister's. "Promise," she asked, the word barely audible. Samuel felt something twist in his chest. "I promise," he said, looking directly into Lily's wide, frightened eyes. "We'll come home together." The trip into town was tense at first. Samuel had rigged the wagon with extra blankets to make a comfortable seat for the girls, but they sat huddled together like birds in a storm, Lily practically in Emma's lap, despite the space available. As they approached Cedar Creek, Samuel found himself seeing it through new eyes: the dusty main street, the modest buildings, the church steeple rising above the cottonwoods. It wasn't grand, but it was civilized, a place where people had planted roots and built lives. He guided the wagon toward Henderson's dry goods, first thinking it best to complete the ostensible purpose of their visit before attending to his legal inquiries. As they pulled up outside the store, he became acutely aware of the glances cast their way, curious, speculative assessing. "Remember," he said quietly to the girls as he helped them down from the wagon, "you don't have to answer any questions you don't want to. Just stay close to me." Emma nodded, her small face set in determination. Lily said nothing, but her grip on her sister's hand tightened visibly. The bell above Henderson's door announced their arrival with cheerful indifference to the tension of the moment. Inside, the store was cool and dim after the bright spring sunshine, smelling of fabric and spice and leather. Mrs. Henderson appeared from behind a display of ribbons, her professional smile faltering slightly at the sight of Samuel with two small girls in tow. "Dr. Thorne," she greeted him, recovering quickly, "and these must be your wards." "Emma and Lily," Samuel confirmed, a hand resting lightly on each girl's shoulder. "We need dresses made, 2 each to start." Mrs. Henderson's gaze swept over the girls, taking in their makeshift clothing. The dresses Samuel had purchased were too large and had been awkwardly pinned to fit in the defensive set of Emma's jaw. "Of course," she said, her tone softening slightly. "Let's get you measured, shall we? I have some lovely calico that would suit you both." Emma looked up at Samuel, who nodded encouragingly. "Go with Mrs. Henderson," he said. "I'll be right here." As the shopkeeper led the girls toward the back of the store, the bell jangled again. Samuel turned to see Victoria Reed enter, her imposing figure perfectly framed in the doorway, like an actress making a calculated entrance. Victoria was in her 50s, her hair still dark without a trace of gray, her posture military straight. She wore black, as she had every day since her husband's death at Antietam, the severity of her mourning dress unrelieved by any touch of color or ornament. Her face might have been handsome once, before grief and righteousness had carved permanent lines around her mouth and between her brows. Her gaze found Samuel immediately narrowing in recognition. "Dr. Thorne," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the store. "What a surprise to see you in town again so soon." Samuel inclined his head slightly. "Mrs. Reed?" She moved toward him with deliberate steps, her skirts rustling against the polished floorboards. "I understand congratulations are in order," she continued. "Reverend Whitman tells me you've become a guardian to 2 young orphans." The pause before guardian was slight but unmistakable, a subtle questioning of his role. "Emma and Lily are staying with me, yes," Samuel replied, keeping his tone neutral. Victoria's gaze flicked toward the back of the store where Mrs. Henderson could be seen measuring Emma with a length of tape. "How charitable of you," she said. "Though one wonders if a bachelor's cabin is the most appropriate environment for young girls." The insinuation hung in the air between them, too vague to challenge directly, but clear enough in its intent. "The girls have a safe home, Mrs. Reed," Samuel said evenly, "which is more than they had before." "Indeed." Victoria adjusted her black gloves, a gesture that somehow managed to convey disapproval. "I'm well acquainted with the Hayes Orphan Asylum, a fine institution providing structure and moral guidance to unfortunate children. It seems unusual that they would release 2 girls to an unmarried man with no experience in child-rearing." The mention of the orphanage by name caught Samuel's attention. "You're familiar with where the girls came from?" "I serve on the board," Victoria confirmed, a touch of pride entering her voice. "We oversee several of such institutions across the state. The Hayes Asylum is one of our finest." Samuel filed this information away, his suspicions about Victoria's concern deepening. "Then perhaps you can tell me why 2 young children were being auctioned off like livestock," he said, unable to keep an edge from his voice. Victoria's expression hardened. "Placement auctions are a practical necessity, Doctor. They ensure children find homes with families who can provide for them. The fees help support the orphanage's continued operation." She lowered her voice slightly. "Surely you understand that your impulsive action, while well-intentioned, circumvented a system designed to protect these children." "I saw a frightened 3-year-old about to be separated from her sister," Samuel replied. "The system didn't seem concerned with protecting them then." A flush of anger touched Victoria's cheeks. "You presume to judge based on a moment's observation, Doctor. The Hayes Asylum has placed hundreds of children in good Christian homes, homes with mothers and fathers proper influence and guidance." Before Samuel could respond, A small voice spoke from behind him. "You're the lady who took Mama's letter." Both adults turned to find Emma standing a few feet away, her face pale but resolute. Lily hovered behind her, partially hidden in her sister's shadow. Victoria's expression flickered briefly, surprise alarm before settling into stern authority. "Young ladies should not interrupt when adults are speaking," she said coldly. Emma didn't flinch. "You came to our house after Papa died." She continued, her voice steady despite its softness. "You took Mama's letter from the soldier, the one that said where Papa was buried." A sudden silence fell over the store. Even Mrs. Henderson, hovering nearby with her measuring tape, seemed to hold her breath. Victoria drew herself up to her full height. "I don't know what you're talking about, child. You're confused." "I'm not," Emma insisted. "You had a black dress then too, and you told Mama that Papa was a traitor." Samuel looked sharply at Victoria, whose face had lost some of its color. "Mrs. Reed," he prompted. Victoria's gaze hardened as she looked from Emma to Samuel. "The child is clearly disturbed," she said dismissively, "inventing stories as orphans often do to gain sympathy. It's a common behavior in children who have been abandoned." "We weren't abandoned," Emma said, her small hands clenching into fists. "Mama didn't leave us. She got sick after you came. She kept saying she had to find Papa's grave, but she couldn't read the map without the letter." Samuel knelt beside Emma, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Emma," he said quietly, "do you remember your father's name?" Emma nodded. "William Hayes. He was a lieutenant in the army." The name struck Samuel like a physical blow. William Hayes. It couldn't be coincidence, the orphanage bearing the same name. Victoria's reaction, the child's certainty. "Lieutenant William Hayes of the 10th Illinois Infantry," he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma's eyes widened. "You knew Papa?" Before Samuel could answer, Victoria intervened, her voice sharp with command. "This is quite enough. Henderson, are you finished with the girls' measurements? Dr. Thorne, I suggest you take these children home. They're clearly overtired and imagining things." Mrs. Henderson nodded hastily, gathering her tape and notes. "All done," she confirmed. "I can have the first dresses ready by week's end." Samuel rose slowly to his feet, his mind racing. William Hayes. The name echoed in his memory, accompanied by the sound of artillery fire and the smell of blood and gunpowder. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson," he said automatically. "Send word when they're ready and I'll come collect them." He ushered the girls toward the door, acutely aware of Victoria Reed's calculating gaze following their every move. Just before they stepped outside, he turned back to her. "Mrs. Reed," he said, his voice low but carrying in the quiet store, "I think we have more to discuss about Lieutenant Hayes and his family." Victoria's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes hardened. "I doubt that very much, Doctor," she replied. "Good day to you." Outside, the spring sunshine seemed too bright, too cheerful for the shadow that had fallen across Samuel's thoughts. He helped the girls into the wagon mechanically, his mind still grappling with the implications of what he had just learned. It wasn't until they were halfway home, the town falling away behind them, that Emma broke the silence. "Did you really know Papa?" she asked, her voice small against the creak of wagon wheels. Samuel looked at her, this child with Martha's eyes, who had just upended his understanding of his own past. "I think I did," he said carefully, "during the war." "Was he brave?" Mama said he was brave. Samuel's throat tightened. William Hayes. The memory was becoming clearer now. A young lieutenant badly wounded at Shiloh, brought to the field hospital where Samuel had worked himself to exhaustion, trying to save the endless stream of broken men. "Yes," he said finally. "He was very brave." Emma nodded, satisfied with this confirmation of what she already believed. "That lady is bad," she said with the simple certainty of childhood. "She made Mama cry." Samuel glanced at Lily, who was watching the exchange with solemn eyes. "What happened after your mother got sick?" he asked gently. "The neighbors called the doctor," Emma replied, "but he couldn't help. Mama kept getting thinner and coughing. Then one day she didn't wake up." Her voice remained steady, but her small hands sought Lily's, squeezing tightly. "The lady came back with men. They took us to the orphanage. They said Mama went west to find work, but I know she didn't. She wouldn't leave us." Samuel felt a cold anger building within him at Victoria Reed, at the orphanage that had lied to these children, at a world that could treat a soldier's family with such callous disregard. I believe you, he said, the words a promise and a declaration. The rest of the journey passed in contemplative silence. When they reached the cabin, Samuel helped the girls down from the wagon, noting the relief in their faces at being home, for it was home now to all of them. As Lily ran to check on the chickens, Emma lingered beside the wagon, looking up at Samuel with those disconcerting eyes. Are you going to send us away? She asked suddenly. Because of what I said to that lady, Samuel knelt down to her level, his heart twisting at the fear beneath her brave exterior. No, he said firmly. Never, because of the truth. Emma studied his face, searching for deception. Promise, I promise, on. He hesitated, then added, Emma, I need to look into some things about your father, about what happened to him and to your mother. Would that be all right with you? She considered this, her young face serious beyond its years, to prove we weren't abandoned. Yes, and to understand why Mrs. Reed seemed so affected by your questions. Emma nodded slowly. Mama would want the truth, she said. She always told us lies make the heart sick. Your mother sounds like a wise woman, Samuel said, his throat tight with emotion. She was, Emma agreed with the simple certainty of a child who had known love. Like you're wise, but different. Before Samuel could respond to this unexpected comparison, Lily called from the chicken coop, her voice lifted in rare excitement over a newly laid egg. Emma turned toward her sister, then looked back at Samuel. Thank you, she said quietly, for believing us. As she ran to join Lily, Samuel remained kneeling in the dirt, overcome by a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since the war. These children, Hayes's children, had found their way to him through what could only be described as providence. And with that realization came a certainty that transcended logic or caution. He would protect them, he would uncover the truth about their parents, and he would make sure Victoria Reed never threatened them again. Rising to his feet, Samuel looked toward the cabin that had been his solitary refuge for so long. In just a week, it had transformed, children's drawings pinned to the walls, small shoes by the door, the sound of laughter occasionally breaking the silence of his grief. I think I understand now, Martha, he whispered to the wind, why they came to me, why I had to help them. And for the first time in 5 years, saying his wife's name didn't bring pain. Instead, there was a sense of rightness, as if pieces of a puzzle were finally falling into place. Samuel Thorne, who had spent years hiding from life, now found himself stepping back into its full current, not for himself, but for 2 small girls who had awakened something in him he had thought long dead. Hope. The next morning, Samuel woke before dawn, his mind still churning with questions about William Hayes and Victoria Reed's connection to the girls. He dressed quietly, not wanting to wake Emma and Lily, and stepped outside to watch the sunrise paint the pines in gold. William Hayes. The name had haunted his sleep, bringing back memories he'd long tried to bury. Shiloh, 1862. The bloodiest battle Samuel had seen until that point in the war, thousands of men torn apart by bullets and shrapnel, overwhelming the field hospitals with their suffering. Samuel had worked for 3 days without sleep, his hands constantly slick with blood, making decisions that would haunt him for years. Who might be saved with surgery, who was beyond help, and could only be made comfortable as they died. Lieutenant Hayes had been in the latter category. A Confederate shell had torn through his side, leaving injuries no surgeon could repair. Samuel remembered him now, a young man with sandy hair and determined eyes clutching a blood-soaked letter as if it were more precious than his fading life. My wife, Hayes had gasped as Samuel examined his wounds. She has to know where to find me after. Samuel had understood then that Hayes knew he was dying, that he was asking for his body to be properly identified and buried so his wife could visit his grave. It was a common concern among the dying, not their own pain, but the suffering of those they would leave behind. I'll make sure of it, Samuel had promised, taking the letter from Hayes's weakening grip. It contained a small, hand-drawn map and instructions. Samuel hadn't read the details, just noted that it was addressed to an Elizabeth Hayes in Cedar Creek, Nebraska. But he had never delivered it. By the time Hayes died, dozens more wounded had arrived, and the precious letter had been lost in the chaos. Or so Samuel had believed. Now, standing on his porch 15 years later, he wondered, had Victoria Reed somehow intercepted that letter? And if so, the sun was fully above the horizon when Samuel heard the cabin door open behind him. Emma slipped out still in her nightgown, her hair tangled from sleep. You're thinking about Papa, she said, not a question but a statement. Samuel turned surprised as always by the child's perceptiveness. Yes. Was he hurt bad in the war? Samuel hesitated, unsure how much to share with a 5-year-old about her father's death. Yes, he said finally. He was very brave, but his injuries were too severe for the doctors to help. Emma nodded, accepting this with the stoicism that still unsettled him in one so young. Mama said he died a hero. She was right. They stood in silence for a moment, watching a pair of bluebirds dart among the pines. Did Papa give you a letter for Mama? Emma asked suddenly, her eyes so like Martha's, fixed intently on his face. The directness of the question caught Samuel off guard. Why do you ask that? Before you came to the auction, I had a dream about Papa. He was giving a letter to a doctor with sad eyes. Emma's small hand reached out, touching his arm lightly. You have sad eyes. Samuel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Yes, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. He gave me a letter for your mother, but I never delivered it. There were so many wounded, so much confusion. I thought it was lost. Emma absorbed this, her face solemn. But the lady, Mrs. Reed, she took a letter from a soldier who came to our house after Papa died. A different soldier, not me. No, a young one with a beard. He said he was Papa's friend. Samuel's mind raced. If Hayes had entrusted his final message to multiple people, hoping to increase the chances of it reaching his wife, it would explain why another soldier had arrived with a similar letter. But it didn't explain Victoria Reed's involvement or why she would intercept such a message. Emma, he said carefully, do you remember anything else about Mrs. Reed's visit? Anything she said to your mother? Emma's brow furrowed in concentration. She said Papa fought for the wrong side, that he was a traitor. She stumbled slightly over the unfamiliar word. Mama got very angry. She said Papa fought for what he believed, even if others didn't understand. A piece of the puzzle clicked into place. If Hayes had been a Confederate sympathizer from a Union state, it would explain Victoria Reed's animosity. Her husband, Colonel Reed, had been a staunch Union officer killed at Antietam. Her hatred for the Confederacy was legendary in Cedar Creek. But to extend that hatred to a widow and her orphaned children, Samuel felt a renewed surge of anger toward Victoria. Dr. Thorne, Emma's voice pulled him from his thoughts. Are you going to try to find the letter? Samuel looked down at her hopeful face and felt the weight of a promise made 15 years too late. Yes, he said, I'm going to try. The moment was interrupted by Lily's appearance in the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes with one small fist, her doll clutched in the other. At the sight of her sister and Samuel deep in conversation, her eyes widened with a familiar anxiety. Emma immediately went to her, taking her hand. It's all right, Lily. We were just talking about Papa. I don't remember Papa, Lily said softly, her voice still rough with sleep. I know, Emma soothed, but Dr. Thorne knew him. In the war. Lily looked up at Samuel, her eyes hazel, unlike her sister's blue, full of questions she didn't know how to ask. Samuel knelt to her level. Your father was very brave, he said gently, and he loved you and your sister and your mother very much. It wasn't much, but it seemed to satisfy something in Lily. She nodded once, then turned to Emma. I'm hungry. The simple statement broke the solemnity of the moment, bringing them back to the practical concerns of the day. Samuel smiled, a rare, unguarded expression. Then we should have breakfast, he said, rising to his feet. I think we have eggs enough for pancakes. The morning passed in domestic routine breakfast chores lessons. Samuel found himself increasingly distracted, his mind returning again and again to the mystery of Hayes's letter and Victoria Reed's interference. By midday, he had made a decision. I need to ride into town this afternoon, he told the girls as they finished their lunch. There are some matters I need to look into. Emma's face immediately tensed. We'll be good. We won't touch anything we shouldn't. The fear beneath her words twisted something in Samuel's chest. I know you will, he said gently. That's not why I'm telling you. I wanted to ask if you'd be all right staying here alone for a few hours. I'll be back before dark. Both girls exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Finally, Emma nodded. We'll be fine. We stayed alone sometimes when Mama was working. Samuel hesitated, torn between his need to investigate and his reluctance to leave them. Bolt the door after I leave, he instructed, and don't open it for anyone but me. We know, Emma said with that disconcerting adult solemnity. We'll be safe. An hour later, Samuel was riding towards Cedar Creek, his medical bag strapped to the saddle, an excuse for his visit should anyone question it. His first destination was the county clerk's office, a small, austere building adjacent to the courthouse. The clerk, Mr. Finch, was a thin, perpetually dusty man who had occupied his position for as long as anyone in Cedar Creek could remember. He looked up from his ledgers with mild surprise as Samuel entered. "Dr. Thorne," he greeted, adjusting his spectacles. "What brings you to my humble domain? Not often we see you in town twice in a fortnight." "I need information, Ezra," Samuel said, keeping his tone casual. "About the Hayes family." Finch's eyebrows rose slightly. "Hayes don't believe I know any Hayes family in Cedar Creek. Not currently, at least. They lived here some years ago, Elizabeth Hayes and her two daughters. The husband was Lieutenant William Hayes, killed at Shiloh." "Ah," Finch's expression cleared. "The Confederate sympathizer's widow. Yes, I remember now." The confirmation of Hayes's Southern allegiance didn't surprise Samuel given Emma's comments, but the clerk's dismissive tone rankled. "I need to know what happened to Elizabeth Hayes after her husband's death," Samuel pressed, "and how her daughters ended up at the Hayes Orphan Asylum." Finch gave him a curious look. "Unusual interest for you, Doctor. Any particular reason?" "The girls are staying with me now," Samuel said simply. "I want to understand their circumstances." "Ah, yes, heard about that." Finch's tone suggested he'd heard quite a lot, and not all of it complimentary. "Well, let me see what we have." He disappeared into a back room lined with shelves of leather-bound volumes and file boxes. Samuel waited, aware that his inquiries would likely be reported to Victoria Reed before sunset. Cedar Creek's efficient gossip network ensured nothing remained private for long. Finch returned several minutes later with a thin folder. "Not much here, I'm afraid. Elizabeth Hayes died of consumption in '72. No significant property. The children became wards of the county and were placed in the orphanage." "The Hayes Orphan Asylum," Samuel noted, "named for their father." "Coincidence, I believe. The asylum was funded by Colonel Reed's estate and named for his mother's family." Finch adjusted his spectacles. "Though now that you mention it, it is an unusual convergence." Samuel felt a cold certainty settling in his gut. The asylum is funded by the Reed estate, and Victoria Reed sits on its board. She's the chairwoman, actually. Finch rifled through the papers. "Established it shortly after the colonel's death. Very charitable work." "Indeed." Samuel kept his tone neutral, though his mind was racing. "What about the Hayes property?" Emma mentioned a house. "Small homestead at the edge of town, nothing grand." Finch consulted another document. "Sold at auction after Mrs. Hayes' death to cover outstanding debts. Purchased by, Reed Enterprises." He looked up, blinking. "Mrs. Reed's company." The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture Samuel didn't like. "And the proceeds of that sale applied to the children's care at the asylum, I would assume? Standard procedure." Finch's thin shoulders lifted in a shrug. "Everything seems to have been handled according to law, Doctor." "According to law, perhaps, but not according to justice or mercy." Samuel thanked the clerk and left his next destination, already clear in his mind. The Presbyterian church stood at the north end of town, its white steeple rising above the surrounding cottonwoods. Samuel tied his horse at the hitching post and mounted the steps, noting the carefully tended flower beds that bordered the walkway, Jacob's influence, no doubt. The minister had always had a fondness for growing things. The church was empty, save for a young woman polishing the altar rail. She looked up at Samuel's entrance, her eyes widening in recognition. "Dr. Thorne," she greeted him, dropping a hasty curtsy. "Reverend Whitman is in his study." Samuel nodded his thanks and made his way to the small room at the rear of the church. The door was ajar, and through it he could see Jacob bent over his desk pen, moving steadily across paper. Samuel knocked lightly on the doorframe. Jacob looked up, surprised, quickly giving way to pleasure. "Sam," he said, rising from his chair, "twice in a week. I'm beginning to think you've had a change of heart about church attendance." "Not quite," Samuel replied, stepping into the study. "I need information, Jacob, about Victoria Reed and the Hayes family." The minister's smile faded. "I see." He gestured to a chair. "Sit, please. This may take some time." Samuel sat, noting the changes in his old friend's study since his last visit years ago. The bookshelves were fuller, the desk more worn. A daguerreotype of a young woman, Jacob's late wife Sarah, still held the place of honor beside the inkwell. Jacob settled back into his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. What exactly do you want to know? Everything, Samuel said simply. I've learned that the girl's father was a Confederate sympathizer, that Victoria Reed had some confrontation with Elizabeth Hayes after his death, and that the orphanage bearing the Hayes name is actually funded by the Reed estate. It's too much for coincidence. Jacob sighed deeply. You're right, of course. I've had my concerns about the situation for years, though I've never been able to prove anything improper. Tell me. William Hayes was from Georgia originally, came north before the war, married Elizabeth, settled here. When the conflict broke out, his sympathies remained with the South, though he initially tried to stay neutral. Jacob's gaze grew distant, recalling events from years past. But after Bull Run, something changed. He enlisted in the Illinois Infantry, a Union regiment, but there were rumors that he was passing information to Confederate contacts. Was he? Samuel asked sharply. Jacob spread his hands. I don't know. Colonel Reed believes so. He had Hayes transferred to the front lines at Shiloh, a virtual death sentence given the fighting there. Samuel felt a cold anger building within him. And after Hayes died, Victoria Reed became convinced that Elizabeth was also a Southern sympathizer. She made it her mission to watch the widow reporting any suspicious activities to the authorities. Nothing ever came of it. Elizabeth was simply a grieving woman trying to raise two young daughters, but Victoria's harassment was relentless. And when Elizabeth died, Jacob's expression grew troubled. That's where things become unclear. The official record shows she died of consumption, her property was sold to cover debts, and the children were placed in the orphanage as they had no other family. But there were whispers that Victoria had engineered the situation, calling in loans against the Hayes property that Elizabeth couldn't possibly repay, ensuring the children were sent to an institution under Victoria's control. Why, Samuel demanded, why extend such hatred to innocent children? Jacob was silent for a long moment. Victoria lost more than her husband at Antietam, he said finally. Their son James was Colonel Reed's aide-de-camp. He died in the same battle. I didn't know she had a son. She rarely speaks of him. The grief, it changed her, Sam, hardened something that was already rigid to begin with. Jacob leaned forward, his expression grave. But there's more. James Reed was captured briefly before Antietam by Confederate scouts. He escaped, but not before being interrogated. Victoria became convinced that information Hayes had passed to the Confederates led directly to James's capture and ultimately to his death at Antietam. Samuel absorbed this, his physician's mind automatically analyzing the psychology behind Victoria's actions. Grief warped into vengeance, loss hardened into cruelty. It didn't excuse her treatment of Elizabeth and the girls, but it explained the intensity of her animosity. And the letter, he asked. Emma says Victoria took a letter from a soldier who came to their house after Hayes died. Jacob nodded slowly. I remember that. A young private arrived about a month after news of Shiloh reached us. He had a letter and a small package for Elizabeth from her husband. Victoria intercepted him before he could deliver them, claiming she was acting as the town's official representative to war widows. Did you see what was in the letter? No, but afterward, Elizabeth was frantic. She kept saying she needed to find William's grave, that she'd promised him she would come when the war ended. Jacob's eyes narrowed suddenly. Sam, why are you asking about a letter after all these years? Samuel met his friend's gaze directly. Because I think I know what was in it, he said quietly. Hayes was brought to my field hospital at Shiloh mortally wounded. Before he died, he gave me a letter for his wife, a map to his grave, and instructions for finding it. I never delivered it. There was so much chaos, so many dying men. I thought it was lost. Jacob's expression shifted to one of dawning comprehension. And now his daughters have found their way to you, after all these years. It seems impossible, Samuel admitted, or providential. Jacob suggested, a hint of his ministerial tone entering his voice. The Lord works in mysterious ways, Sam. Samuel wasn't ready to attribute the situation to divine intervention, but he couldn't deny the extraordinary coincidence that had brought Hayes's daughters into his care 15 years after he had failed their father. I need to know if that letter still exists, he said, and what else Victoria might be hiding about the Hayes family. Jacob's face grew troubled. Challenging Victoria Reed is not something to undertake lightly, Sam. She has considerable influence in this town, with the church board, with the county commissioners, with Judge Howard. I'm not concerned about her influence. Welcome. You should be, too. Jacob said bluntly, especially now that you've taken in the Hayes girls. Victoria could make a case that you're an unsuitable guardian, a reclusive widower with no experience raising children who, by his own admission, has a connection to their father's death. The warning struck home. Samuel had already considered the precariousness of his situation with Em and Lily, but hearing Jacob articulate the specific vulnerabilities made them more real. "What would you suggest?" he asked, swallowing his pride. Jacob considered for a moment. "Secure your legal position first. File for formal guardianship of the girls. I can help with the paperwork and speak as a character witness if needed. And Victoria, tread carefully, gather information, but don't confront her directly." "Not yet." Jacob leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Sam, those girls have already lost too much. Don't risk losing them in a battle with Victoria unless you're certain you can win." The advice was sound if frustrating. Samuel nodded reluctantly. "I'll focus on the guardianship first." "Good." Jacob rose, signaling the end of their conversation. "And Sam, bring the girls to church on Sunday. It would help establish your respectability in the community's eyes." Samuel grimaced but didn't refuse outright. "I'll consider it." Outside, the afternoon had waned, the sun beginning its descent toward the western horizon. Samuel mounted his horse, his mind full of all he had learned. The pieces were coming together, forming a picture of injustice, spanning years of vendetta carried out against innocent children for their father's alleged sins. As he rode toward home, Samuel's resolve hardened. He would protect Emma and Lily. He would uncover the full truth about their parents. And somehow he would make right what had gone so terribly wrong. The cabin came into view just as the sun touched the tops of the pines, casting long shadows across the clearing. Samuel dismounted, noting with approval that no smoke rose from the chimney. Despite the cooling evening air, the girls had heeded his warnings about fire safety in his absence. He approached the door and knocked gently. "Emma!" "Lily, it's Samuel." There was a moment of silence, then the sound of the bolt being drawn back. The door opened to reveal Emma, her face tight with anxiety that relaxed at the sight of him. "You're back," she said, relief evident in her voice. "As promised," Samuel replied, stepping inside. The cabin was quiet and undisturbed. Lily sat at the table, a sheet of paper before her, covered in carefully drawn letters, practicing her alphabet, Samuel realized. "Were you good while I was gone?" he asked, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. "We were quiet as mice," Emma assured him. "Lily did her letters and I read the book you gave me, 3 whole chapters." "Excellent," Samuel said, genuine pride warming his voice. "I brought something for supper." He produced a paper-wrapped package from his saddlebag, fresh bread from the bakery and cheese. Lily's face lit up at this treat. Samuel realized with a pang how little it took to please these children who had known such hardship. As they prepared the simple meal together, Samuel debated how much to share with Emma about what he had learned. She was young, too young to understand the complexities of war and vengeance, the twisted paths grief could lead a person down. And yet she had already experienced more of life's cruelties than most adults. She deserved some truth at least. "I spoke with Reverend Whitman today," he said as they sat down to eat. "About your parents." Emma's hand paused halfway to her mouth. "Did he know them?" "He knew of them," Samuel clarified. "He confirmed some of what you told me about Mrs. Reed coming to your house after your father died." Emma nodded, unsurprised. "Mama said Mrs. Reed was a sad lady who turned her sadness into meanness." The simple wisdom of this assessment struck Samuel forcibly. "Your mother was right," he said. "Mrs. Reed lost her husband and son in the war. Her grief made her unkind. Is that why she took Papa's letter? Because she was sad?" Samuel chose his words carefully. "She took it because she was angry at your father. She believed he had done something wrong during the war." "Did he?" Emma's direct gaze challenged him to speak the truth. "I don't know," Samuel admitted. "But even if he did, that wouldn't justify how she treated your mother or you and Lily." Emma considered this, her young face solemn. "Are you going to find the letter?" "I'm going to try, but first I need to make sure you and Lily can stay here with me legally. I'm going to apply to be your guardian." "What does that mean?" "It means I would be responsible for you both, for feeding you, clothing, you educating, you keeping you safe. I would be like family." Something flickered in Emma's eyes, hope quickly guarded. "Forever." The question held such longing that Samuel felt his throat tighten. "If you want," he said softly, "for as long as you need me." Emma glanced at Lily, who was listening intently despite her pretense of focusing on her bread and cheese. "We want to stay," Emma said, finally speaking for both of them. "We like it here." "Then I'll make it happen," Samuel promised, the words feeling like a vow. Later, after the girls had gone to bed in the loft, Samuel sat by the fire with a glass of whiskey, his first in months. The events of the day had left him drained, but determined, his mind still processing all he had learned about the Hayes family and Victoria Reed's involvement in their fate. The parallels to his own life weren't lost on him. He too had lost a spouse, and child had allowed grief to isolate him from the world. But unlike Victoria, he hadn't turned his pain outward, weaponizing it against others. Instead, he had turned it inward, building walls around what remained of his heart. Until now. Until two small girls with familiar eyes and unfamiliar courage had somehow breached those walls. Samuel raised his glass in a silent toast to Martha, to her memory, to her eyes living on in a child who needed him, to the strange workings of fate that had brought Hayes's daughters to his door. "I think I understand now," he whispered to the empty room. "Why they found me. Why I needed to be found." Outside, a gentle spring rain began to fall, pattering on the roof and against the windows. Inside, for the first time in 5 years, Samuel Thorne felt the stirrings of purpose, of connection, of hope. Sunday dawned clear and mild, the world washed clean by the night's rain. Samuel woke early, his decision made. They would attend church not for his sake, but for the girls. Jacob was right. Establishing their respectability in the community's eyes was important, particularly with Victoria Reed's influence looming over them. He broached the subject at breakfast, watching Emma's face carefully for her reaction. "I thought we might go to church today," he said casually. "Reverend Whitman has invited us." Emma looked up from her porridge, surprise evident in her expression. "Church like we used to with Mama." "Yes, would you like that?" She glanced at Lily, who was methodically adding berries to her porridge in a careful pattern. "We haven't been since Mama died," Emma said slowly. "But I remember the singing." Lily liked the singing. Lily nodded without looking up, confirming her sister's assessment. "We don't have to go," Samuel assured them, not wanting them to feel pressured. "But it might be nice to meet some of the other families in town. There are children your age who attend." This caught Lily's attention. She looked up, her spoon pausing halfway to her mouth. "Other children?" she asked, her voice soft with wonder. Samuel nodded. "Several families have children around your ages." The girls exchanged one of their silent communications, a language of glances and subtle expressions that Samuel was beginning to recognize but couldn't yet interpret. "All right," Emma decided, speaking for both as usual. "We'll go." The preparations that followed were more elaborate than any they had undertaken since the girls' arrival. Samuel helped them wash and dress in their newly completed gowns, from Mrs. Henderson, simple but well-made dresses of blue calico for Emma and yellow for Lily. Emma sat patiently while Samuel attempted to braid her hair, following her detailed instructions with the concentration he usually reserved for difficult surgeries. "Like this?" he asked, holding up the uneven results for her inspection. Emma's lips twitched in what might have been a suppressed smile. "Almost," she said diplomatically. "Maybe I can do Lily's, and you can watch." Samuel readily agreed to this arrangement, watching with admiration as Emma's small fingers deftly wove her sister's curls into a neat braid tied with a ribbon. His own preparations were simpler, but no less significant. He shaved carefully, donned his best suit, worn at the elbows but still presentable, and polished his boots until they gleamed. The man who looked back at him from the small mirror above the wash basin was a stranger, less haggard somehow than the face he was accustomed to seeing. They arrived at the church as the bell was ringing, calling the faithful to worship. Samuel helped the girls down from the wagon, acutely aware of the eyes turning their way as they approached the white-painted steps. Emma's hand found his, her grip tight with nervousness. Lily stayed close to her sister, eyes wide as she took in the gathering crowd. Jacob met them at the door, his clerical collar stark against his black coat. "Samuel," he greeted warmly, then bent to the girls' level. "Emma, Lily, I'm so glad you could join us today." Emma managed a polite curtsy, but Lily half hid behind her sister, overwhelmed by the attention. "We have a special place for families in the third pew," Jacob continued, straightening. "Mrs. Pemberton will show you." A kindly-looking woman in a lavender dress stepped forward, smiling at the girls with genuine warmth. "Come with me, dears," she said, extending a hand. "My grandchildren sit in the same pew. They're just about your ages." Emma looked to Samuel for permission, At his nod, she cautiously took Mrs. Pemberton's offered hand, keeping a firm grip on Lily with her other. As they followed Miss Pemberton into the church, Jacob placed a hand on Samuel's arm, holding him back momentarily. "Victoria's here," he murmured. "Front pew as always. She's already noticed your arrival." Samuel wasn't surprised. "Let her look," he said quietly. "We have nothing to hide." "Just be prepared," Jacob warned. "She won't take this development lightly." Inside the church was filled with the hushed murmurs of a congregation settling before worship. Samuel slid into the pew beside Emma, nodding politely to the elderly couple sharing their bench. Ahead of them, just as Jacob had said, Victoria Reed sat ramrod straight in the front pew, her black-clad figure unmistakable even from behind. The service began with a hymn, the congregation rising as one, as the small organ wheezed into life. Samuel found the page in the hymnal and held it so both girls could see, though neither could read music. To his surprise, Lily began to sing along, her small voice clear and sweet, remembering words she must have learned from her mother years before. The familiar ritual of worship there, the prayers, the scripture readings, the sermon washed over Samuel like a forgotten tide. How long had it been since he'd attended a service? Since Martha's funeral, he realized with a pang. 5 years of Sundays spent alone in his cabin, while the rest of Cedar Creek gathered here to seek comfort and community. Jacob's sermon was on the parable of the Good Samaritan, a choice Samuel suspected was deliberate given recent events. The minister spoke eloquently of kindness to strangers, of setting aside prejudice to help those in need, of the unexpected ways God worked through human compassion. "We are called." Jacob concluded, his gaze sweeping the congregation, but lingering briefly on Victoria Reed's rigid back, "to look beyond our own pain, our own grievances, to see the humanity in every face we encounter. To ask not, 'Who is my neighbor?' but rather, 'To whom can I be a neighbor today?'" After the final hymn and benediction, the congregation filed out into the spring sunshine for the social hour that traditionally followed worship. Samuel would have preferred to leave immediately, but Emma and Lily were already being introduced to the Pemberton grandchildren, 2 boys and a girl who regarded the newcomers with friendly curiosity. "Dr. Thorne," a woman's voice addressed him as he stood watching the children's tentative interactions. He turned to find Mrs. Pemberton beside him, her kind face creased in a smile. "It's good to see you in church again, and with such lovely girls." "Thank you," Samuel replied somewhat stiffly. He had never been comfortable with small talk even before his withdrawal from society. "They're settling in well with you?" Mrs. Pemberton asked, her tone genuinely interested rather than gossipy. "Yes, they're remarkable children. They must be to have endured so much." Mrs. Pemberton's gaze grew thoughtful. "I knew their mother slightly. Elizabeth was a gentle soul devoted to her daughters. It was a tragedy her passing so young." Samuel seized the opening. "Did you know her well enough to understand why Victoria Reed took such an interest in her affairs?" Mrs. Pemberton glanced around, ensuring they weren't overheard. "Only what most in town suspected," she said quietly. "That Victoria blamed William Hayes for her son's death. James was captured by Confederates before Antietam, you see. Victoria became convinced that Hayes had passed information that led to the capture. Was there any truth to it? Who can say war makes monsters of good men and martyrs of scoundrels? But even if Hayes was guilty of what she suspected, punishing his widow and orphans—" Mrs. Pemberton shook her head. "It wasn't Christian, Dr. Thorne, not by any measure." Their conversation was interrupted by Emma's return, her face flushed with unexpected pleasure. "Dr. Thorne," she said, tugging at his sleeve, "Mrs. Pemberton's granddaughter Abigail has invited us to a picnic next Saturday. May we go?" The simple normality of the request, a child asking permission for a social engagement, struck Samuel forcibly. Emma and Lily deserved this friends' picnics, the ordinary joys of childhood that had been denied them at the orphanage. "If Mrs. Pemberton is agreeable, then yes, of course," he said. Mrs. Pemberton beamed. "Wonderful, we'll send the wagon for them around midday. The children will be so pleased." As she moved away to collect her grandchildren, Samuel felt a presence at his back, a prickling awareness that made him turn sharply. Victoria Reed stood a few paces away, her dark eyes fixed on him with undisguised hostility. "Dr. Thorne," she said, her voice carrying just enough to draw attention from those nearby. "How unexpected to see you in God's house after all these years. One might almost suspect an ulterior motive." Samuel inclined his head slightly. Mrs. Reed, I assure you my only motive was to allow Emma and Lily to participate in the community. Indeed. Her gaze shifted to Emma, who had moved protectively closer to Samuel's side. I've been meaning to speak with you about the girls' situation. It seems highly irregular for two young ladies to be placed with a bachelor of no relation, particularly one with your history. The implied threat was clear, as was the reference to his well-known withdrawal after Martha's death. Samuel felt Emma tense beside him, her small hand seeking his. Their situation is being formalized through proper legal channels, he replied evenly. And as for my suitability as a guardian, I believe Reverend Whitman and others in the community would vouch for my character. Victoria's lips thinned. Legal formalities can be complex, especially when there might be questions about a child's background or parentage. Emma's grip on Samuel's hand tightened painfully. He looked down to see her face had gone pale, her eyes wide, with an emotion he couldn't immediately identify. Fear, yes, but also a dawning comprehension, as if Victoria's words had confirmed some long-held suspicion. If you have specific concerns, Mrs. Reed, Samuel said, his voice hardening, I suggest you address them to Judge Howard directly. In the meantime, I would appreciate it if you would refrain from upsetting the children with vague insinuations. Several nearby congregants had stopped their conversations to listen, creating a bubble of awkward silence around the confrontation. Victoria was too shrewd to escalate the situation further in such a public setting. Of course, she said, her tone falsely conciliatory. I only have the children's best interests at heart, as I'm sure you do. She nodded curtly and moved away, her black skirts rustling against the grass. Samuel looked down at Emma, concerned by her continued pallor. Are you all right? He asked quietly. She nodded, but her eyes remained troubled. Can we go home now? Yes, he said immediately. Let's find Lily and head back. They located Lily playing a clapping game with Abigail Pemberton, her face alight with an animation Samuel had never seen before. She protested briefly at having to leave, but acquiesced when Emma whispered something in her ear. The ride home was subdued, both girls unusually quiet. Samuel didn't press them, sensing they needed time to process the morning's events, the church service, the new acquaintances, and most particularly Victoria Reed's veiled threats. It wasn't until they were nearly home, the cabin just visible through the pines, that Emma finally spoke. Dr. Thorne, she said, her voice small against the creak of the wagon wheels. What did Miss Reed mean about our background and parentage? Samuel chose his words carefully. I believe she was trying to suggest that there might be questions about your father's loyalty during the war or your mother's circumstances after his death. But they're just attempts to cause trouble, Emma. Nothing for you to worry about. Emma wasn't satisfied with this explanation. It's more than that, she insisted. The way she looked at me, like she knows something about us that we don't. Samuel was struck again by the child's perceptiveness. Emma, I promise you, if there are secrets about your family, we'll uncover them together. But right now, what matters most is ensuring that you and Lily can stay with me legally without interference. She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, she said, though her tone suggested she was merely setting the matter aside, not abandoning it. As they pulled up to the cabin, Samuel was surprised to see a horse tied to the hitching post, a fine bay gelding he didn't recognize. A man rose from the porch steps at their approach, tall and lean, in a well-cut suit that marked him as a visitor to Cedar Creek rather than a resident. Dr. Thorne, the stranger called as Samuel set the brake on the wagon. Yes, Samuel replied cautiously, helping the girls down, but keeping them slightly behind him. The man approached, removing his hat to reveal sandy hair going gray at the temples. My name is Daniel Carter, he said, extending his hand. I'm an attorney from Lincoln. I believe we have matters of mutual interest to discuss regarding the Hayes family. Samuel felt Emma go still beside him. He placed a protective hand on her shoulder as he shook Carter's offered hand. What kind of matters? Carter glanced at the girls and back to Samuel. Perhaps we could speak privately. Anything concerning Emma and Lily can be said in front of them, Samuel replied firmly. They've had too many adults making decisions about their lives without their knowledge. The attorney seemed to assess Samuel anew at this statement. Very well, he said after a moment. I represent the estate of Lieutenant William Hayes. I've been searching for his daughters for some time, ever since their mother's death. Emma's head snapped up. Papa had an estate. Carter's expression softened as he looked at the child. Yes, Miss Hayes. Your father left certain properties and investments in trust for you and your sister. Properties that should have passed to you upon your mother's death, but which appear to have been redirected. Samuel felt a surge of vindication mixed with anger. Redirected by whom? That's what I'm here to determine, Carter replied. I have reason to believe that Victoria Reed and the directors of the Hayes Orphan Asylum have been inappropriately managing funds intended for your wards. Samuel invited the attorney inside, his mind racing with implications. As Emma and Lily changed out of their church clothes, he prepared coffee, watching Carter examine the cabin with interest. You've made a good home for them, the attorney observed, much better than where they were. You've seen the orphanage, Carter nodded grimly. I visited 3 days ago after tracing the Hayes girls' paper trail to Cedar Creek. The conditions, he paused, choosing his words carefully. Let's just say it appears the funds from the Hayes Trust were not being used for the children's benefit as stipulated. How did you find us? Small towns talk, doctor. When I inquired about 2 girls recently removed from the orphanage, several people mentioned your name, though the stories varied considerably as to how they came into your care. Samuel grimaced, imagining the versions of events circulating through Cedar Creek. I purchased their indenture contracts at an auction, he said bluntly, to prevent them being separated and sold as servants. Carter's eyebrows rose. Indenture contracts for children under 6, that's highly irregular, if not illegal. I'm beginning to understand that many irregular things have happened to these children, Samuel replied grimly. The girls returned, now dressed in their everyday clothes, and settled at the table. Emma's eyes never left the attorney's face, her expression a mixture of wariness and hope. Mr. Carter, she said formally, did you know our papa? The attorney shook his head. No, Miss Hayes. I was retained by his family's law firm in Georgia after his death. Your father came from a prominent family in Savannah. They lost touch with him during the war, but never stopped trying to locate him or his children. Should we have family? Emma's voice cracked slightly on the word. In Georgia. Your father's younger sister, Margaret, is still living. She never married and has spent considerable resources trying to find you both. Samuel watched the emotions play across Emma's face. Shock, confusion, hope, fear. Why didn't she find us before, the child asked. When Mama was sick, when we needed help. Carter's expression grew troubled. That's part of what I'm investigating. It appears that letters sent to your mother after Lieutenant Hayes' death were intercepted, and after her passing information about your whereabouts was deliberately obscured. By Mrs. Reed, Emma said with certainty. That's my suspicion, yes, though proving it will be another matter. Samuel interjected. What does this mean for the girls now, legally? It means, Carter said, looking directly at Emma and Lily, that you have family who wants you, and a trust fund that should have been providing for your care all these years. The implications hung in the air like smoke. Family in Georgia. Money that had been stolen or misused. And Victoria Reed at the center of it all, her vendetta against William Hayes extending even to denying his children their rightful inheritance and family connections. Emma looked from Carter to Samuel, her young face troubled. Does this mean we have to go to Georgia? She asked in a small voice. Carter shook his head. Not necessarily. There are legal matters to resolve first, and your aunt has authorized me to act in your best interests, whatever those may be. He hesitated, then added gently, she would like to meet you, of course, but she understands you've been through a great deal. We want to stay with Dr. Thorne, Lily said suddenly, her voice stronger than Samuel had ever heard it. He takes care of us. The simple declaration touched Samuel deeply. He cleared his throat, addressing Carter. I've begun the process to become their legal guardian. In light of what you've told us, does that change? Carter considered this. It complicates matters, certainly. But if it's what the girls want, and you're willing, we could potentially work out an arrangement that respects their aunt's rights while allowing them to remain in your care. It is what I want, Samuel said firmly. Emma's eyes, so like Martha's, filled with tears that didn't fall. What happens now? She asked Carter. Now, the attorney said, reaching into his briefcase and extracting a leather-bound document, I file formal protests against the mismanagement of your trust. I petition the court to recognize your aunt as your legal next of kin. And most importantly, I ensure that Victoria Reed can never again interfere with your lives. Samuel felt a fierce satisfaction at these words, but also a growing concern. Victoria Reed was not a woman to surrender power willingly. If she had gone to such lengths to punish William Hayes through his children, what might she do when directly challenged? "She'll fight this," he warned Carter, "with everything she has." The attorney's expression hardened. "Let her try. I've built cases against bigger opponents than a small-town widow with delusions of grandeur." After Carter left, promising to return in 2 days with formal documents for Samuel to sign, the cabin felt strangely quiet. Emma sat at the table, her face thoughtful as she absorbed all she had learned. Lily had retreated to her doll, speaking to it in soft tones that didn't carry. "Are you all right?" Samuel asked Emma, sitting beside her. She looked up at him, those blue-gold eyes troubled. "We have family," she said wonderingly. "All this time, and we have family." "Yes," Samuel acknowledged. "It's a lot to take in." "But," she hesitated, her small face creasing with worry. "What if they want to take us away to Georgia?" Samuel chose his words carefully, not wanting to make promises he couldn't keep. "Mr. Carter seemed to think we could work out an arrangement where you could stay here but still know your aunt." "I want that," Emma said immediately. "I want to know about Papa's family, but I don't want to leave you." She looked down at her hands twisting in her lap. "You feel like home now." The simple declaration pierced Samuel's heart. "You and Lily are home to me too," he said softly, "and I'll do everything I can to make sure we stay together." Emma nodded, seemingly satisfied with this promise. "Mrs. Reed is going to be very angry," she observed with the directness of childhood. "Yes," Samuel agreed, seeing no point in pretending otherwise. "But she can't hurt you anymore. I won't let her." "I know," Emma said, and the trust in those 3 simple words filled Samuel with a fierce determination to prove worthy of it. Outside, the spring day continued its gentle progression toward evening sunlight, slanting through the pines to dapple the cabin floor with gold. Inside, Samuel Thorne watched the 2 small girls, who had so unexpectedly become the center of his world, and felt something long dormant within him stir to life. Hope, yes, but also something stronger, more primitive, the instinct to protect, to fight if necessary, to ensure that these children who had endured so much would never again know fear or abandonment or cruelty. Victoria Reed might have wealth and influence on her side, but Samuel had truth. And he realized with a certainty that surprised him, he had love, not the memory of love that had sustained him through lonely years, but a new fierce love for 2 small girls who needed him as much as he needed them. It would be enough. It had to be. The courtroom scene that had played out in Samuel's imagination now loomed as reality. 2 days after Daniel Carter's unexpected visit, a messenger arrived at the cabin with an official summons. A hearing was scheduled for the following Monday to determine the guardianship of Emma and Lily Hayes. Samuel read the document twice, his physician's eyes noting details others might miss. The petition had been filed not by Carter as expected, but by Victoria Reed herself, requesting that the girls be returned to the Hayes Orphan Asylum for their moral and spiritual welfare. The hearing would be presided over by Judge Howard, a man known to be firmly in Victoria's social circle. Emma watched his face as he read, her own expression growing tense at whatever she saw there. "Bad news," she asked, her voice small but steady. Samuel hesitated, torn between protecting her and respecting her right to know matters that affected her future. "Mrs. Reed has asked the court to send you and Lily back to the orphanage," he said, finally deciding honesty was kinder than false reassurance. Emma's face paled, but she didn't cry out or protest. Instead, she asked with that disconcerting adult calmness, "Can she do that?" "She can try," Samuel replied, kneeling to her level, "but Mr. Carter and I won't let it happen. I promise you that." Emma studied his face, searching for doubt or deception. Finding neither, she nodded once. "Should we tell Lily?" "Not yet," Samuel decided. "Let her enjoy her morning." He glanced toward the window where Lily could be seen in the garden, carefully watering the seedlings they had planted together the previous week. Her small face was intent with concentration, lips moving in what appeared to be a conversation with the plants. "She's happy here," Emma said, following his gaze. "She talks more now, and she doesn't have nightmares every night." "I've noticed," Samuel said softly. Emma turned back to him, her blue-gold eyes serious. "Dr. Thorne, if the judge says we have to go back, we'll run away. I've done it before." The matter-of-fact statement chilled Samuel. He had suspected the girls might have attempted escape from the orphanage, but hearing it confirmed and hearing Emma's readiness to do it again brought home the desperation they had endured. "It won't come to that," he assured her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "But if it did, you wouldn't have to run alone. Remember what I told you, if you go, I go with you." The tension in Emma's small body eased slightly under his touch. "I remember," she said. "You promised." "And I keep my promises," Samuel said firmly. He dispatched a message to Carter immediately, then spent the morning in what outward normalcy he could manage: lessons for the girls' chores around the cabin, preparation for lunch. But his mind was racing, calculating strategies, weighing options. Victoria's move had been predictable, but still caught him off guard with its swiftness. She must have filed her petition immediately after church on Sunday, perhaps already having the paperwork prepared in anticipation of their appearance. The timing of the hearing, less than a week away, suggested she had used her influence with Judge Howard to expedite matters. After lunch, while the girls napped in the loft, a routine Samuel had established to ensure they received adequate rest after their undernourished time at the orphanage, he rode into town. His destination was not the courthouse or Jacob's church, but a small house at the edge of Cedar Creek, set back from the road behind a grove of cottonwoods. The woman who answered his knock was in her 60s, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun that did nothing to soften her sharp features. "Dr. Thorne," she greeted him, surprise evident in her tone. "What brings you to my door after all these years?" "Hello, Ida," Samuel replied. "I need information that only you can provide." Ida Barnes had been Cedar Creek's midwife for over 30 years before arthritis forced her retirement. She had also been Martha's closest friend, one of the few people who had tried to maintain contact with Samuel after his withdrawal from society. That he had rebuffed these attempts was a regret he carried silently. Ida studied him for a moment, then stepped back from the door. "You'd better come in, then." Her sitting room was cluttered but clean, every surface covered with the evidence of her current passion: quilting. Half-finished squares in vibrant colors were pinned to frames, and baskets of fabric scraps lined the walls. "Tea," she offered, gesturing to a chair. "Thank you, no," Samuel declined. "I won't take much of your time." Ida settled into her own chair, hands folded in her lap. "This is about those Hayes girls, I presume, the ones you've taken in." "News traveled fast in Cedar Creek." Samuel nodded. "Victoria Reed has filed a petition to have them returned to the orphanage. There's a hearing on Monday." "That woman," Ida muttered, shaking her head, "still fighting a war that ended 15 years ago." "You knew Elizabeth Hayes," Samuel said, not a question but a statement. "I delivered both her daughters," Ida confirmed. "Sweet woman Elizabeth. Didn't deserve what happened to her." "What exactly did happen?" "The official record says consumption, but—" Ida's eyes narrowed. "You're asking if Victoria Reed had a hand in her death." "Did she?" The old midwife sighed deeply. "Not directly, no. Elizabeth did die of consumption. I saw the symptoms myself. But Victoria made her last years a misery. After William died, she spread rumors that Elizabeth was a Confederate spy, that she was morally unfit to raise children. Made it nearly impossible for her to find decent work. Emma mentioned that their mother was working before she died. Do you know where?" "At the Reed textile mill," Ida said grimly. "The irony doesn't escape you, I'm sure. Victoria owned the mill but kept her name off the official papers. She had Elizabeth working 12-hour shifts in air thick with cotton dust. For a woman already weakened by grief and poor nutrition, it would have accelerated the consumption." Samuel finished medical knowledge, filling in the blanks Ida left. "Precisely. By the time Elizabeth came to me for help, the disease was too far advanced. All I could do was make her comfortable and promise to look in on the girls." Ida's face clouded with old grief. "A promise I couldn't keep, as it turned out. Victoria had them whisked away to that so-called orphanage before Elizabeth was even buried." "Did you know about the letters from William's family in Georgia?" Ida nodded slowly. "Elizabeth mentioned them once. Said her husband's sister had written offering to take in her and the girls. But the letters stopped coming, and Elizabeth assumed the family had rescinded the offer." "They were intercepted," Samuel said flatly, "by Victoria." "I suspected as much," Ida agreed. "But suspicion isn't proof, Samuel. And Victoria Reed has spent 15 years building herself into a pillar of this community. Her charity work, her donations to the church, all carefully calculated to ensure no one questions her methods or motives." "Someone needs to question them now," Samuel said, an edge entering his voice. "Those girls have suffered enough." Ida studied him, her shrewd eyes taking in the changes since they had last spoken, the new purpose in his bearing, the fire that had replaced emptiness in his gaze. "You care for them," she observed. "Truly care for them." "I do." "Then you should know everything." Ida rose stiffly and crossed to a small secretary desk in the corner. From a locked drawer, she withdrew a sealed envelope yellowed with age. "Elizabeth left this with me before she died, made me promise to give it to the girls when they were old enough to understand. I tried to find them after they were taken to the orphanage, but Victoria made sure I was denied access." She handed the envelope to Samuel. His name was written on the front in a delicate feminine hand, Dr. Samuel Thorne. "She addressed it to me," he asked, bewildered, "but I never met Elizabeth Hayes." "Read it," Ida suggested, lowering herself back into her chair. "It explains more than I can." With careful fingers, Samuel broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The handwriting was shaky but legible, the words clearly written with failing strength to Thorne. "If you are reading this, then my daughters have somehow found their way to you as William believed they would. My husband spoke of you in his last letter, the one Victoria Reed prevented from reaching me. He said you were a man of honor who tried to save him at Shiloh, who promised to deliver his final message to me. I do not blame you for failing in this task. War creates chaos that consumes the best intentions. But William was certain that someday, somehow, our paths would cross again. He believed in what he called the poetry of God's will, that broken circles would be made whole, that promises unfulfilled would find their completion in unexpected ways. My daughters Em and Lily are all that remain of our brief happiness. William's family in Savannah would welcome them, but Victoria Reed has ensured they cannot be found. If you are reading this, then you have already begun to unravel the web she has woven. There is one thing more you should know. The letter William sent with you and with the young private who reached me too late contained not only directions to his grave, but also proof of his innocence. William was not a Confederate spy, as Victoria believes. He was working for the Union as a double agent feeding false information to the South. Colonel Reed knew this. It was he who recruited William for this dangerous role. The proof is in a small tin box buried with William at Shiloh, marked with a carved wooden cross. Victoria's son James was not captured because of William's betrayal, but because of his own father's orders. Colonel Reed sacrificed his son's unit to maintain William's cover, a decision that haunted him until his own death at Antietam. I entrust this truth to you, Dr. Thorne, and ask that you protect my daughters from Victoria's misplaced vengeance. They are innocent of their father's choices, whether heroic or misguided. They deserve a life free from the shadows of a war they never knew. With deepest gratitude for whatever kindness you have shown them. Elizabeth Hayes. Samuel lowered the letter, his mind reeling with its implications. William Hayes had been a Union operative all along. Colonel Reed had known and had sacrificed his own son to maintain Hayes's cover. And Victoria's years of vengeance had been built on a terrible misunderstanding, one her husband had never corrected before his own death. "Did you read this?" he asked Ida. The old midwife shook her head. "Elizabeth sealed it before giving it to me. She said it contained truths that were dangerous in the wrong hands." "Dangerous indeed," Samuel murmured, folding the letter carefully and tucking it into his inner pocket. "Thank you for keeping it safe all these years. Will it help with the hearing?" Samuel considered this. If what Elizabeth wrote is true, and if the proof she mentioned still exists, it could change everything. But getting to Shiloh and back before Monday would be impossible. "Then you'll have to find another way," Ida said practically. "Victoria Reed has spent 15 years building her righteousness on William Hayes's supposed betrayal. If that foundation crumbles, so might her influence," Samuel finished. "But without the proof, it's just Elizabeth's word against Victoria's reputation." Ida leaned forward, her gaze intense. "Sometimes, Samuel, the truth doesn't need proof to be powerful. Sometimes it only needs to be spoken aloud after years of silence." Samuel pondered this wisdom as he rode home, Elizabeth's letter a weight against his heart. The pieces were falling into place now. William Hayes's final request, Victoria's vendetta, the strange workings of fate that had brought Hayes's daughters to the very doctor who had failed to deliver their father's last message. The poetry of God's will, Hayes had called it. Samuel wasn't sure about God's involvement, but he couldn't deny the extraordinary convergence of events that had led to this moment. As the cabin came into view, Samuel spotted Emma sitting on the porch steps, clearly watching for his return. She stood as he approached, her small face tight with worry that eased visibly at the sight of him. "You came back," she said, relief evident in her voice. The simple statement, a child's fear that an adult might not return, twisted something in Samuel's chest. "Of course I did," he replied, dismounting. "This is home." Emma nodded, accepting this. "Lily's still sleeping," she reported. "I checked on her twice." "Thank you." Samuel secured his horse to the hitching post and joined Emma on the porch steps. For a moment, they sat in companionable silence, watching the late afternoon sun filter through the pines. "Did you learn anything in town?" Emma asked finally. "About Mrs. Reed and the hearing?" Samuel hesitated, weighing how much to share with a 5-year-old, even one as preternaturally mature as Emma. "I visited an old friend," he said carefully. "Someone who knew your mother." Emma's head snapped up, her eyes suddenly intent. "Who, Mrs. Barnes? She was the midwife who helped when you and Lily were born." "I remember her," Emma said softly. "She used to bring us peppermint candy. She stopped coming after Mama got sick." Samuel nodded. "Mrs. Reed prevented her from visiting you." Emma absorbed this without surprise, as if it merely confirmed what she already knew about Victoria's interference in their lives. "Did Mrs. Barnes tell you about Mama?" "Yes, and she gave me something your mother left for you and Lily." Samuel reached into his pocket and withdrew the envelope, now carefully resealed. "When you're older, we'll read it together. It explains some things about your father, good things that Mrs. Reed doesn't know or doesn't want to believe." Emma stared at the envelope with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. "Can't we read it now?" "Some of it is complicated," Samuel explained gently. "About the war and why your father fought and choices he made that were brave but difficult to understand." Emma considered this, then nodded reluctantly. "All right, but you'll keep it safe until then." "I promise, Brian." They sat in silence for another moment, each lost in thought. Then Emma asked in a small voice, "Are you scared about the hearing?" The question caught Samuel off guard. "Why do you ask that?" "Because I am," Emma admitted, looking down at her hands. "And I thought maybe grown-ups get scared too sometimes." Samuel felt something shift in his chest, a breaking down of the last wall between them, perhaps. "Yes," he said softly. "Grown-ups get scared too. I am worried about the hearing, but not because I think we'll lose." "Then why?" "Because I don't want you and Lily to have to face Mrs. Reed again, or to hear the things she might say about your parents." Emma nodded, understanding. "She'll say mean things, like she did to Mama." "Probably," Samuel acknowledged. "But they won't be true, and this time you won't be facing her alone." Emma's small hand found his, her fingers warm and trusting against his palm. "We'll be brave together," she said with a certainty that humbled him. "Yes," Samuel agreed gently, squeezing her hand. "We will." The days leading up to the hearing passed in a blur of preparation. Daniel Carter arrived on Thursday as promised, bringing formal guardianship papers for Samuel to sign in a letter from Margaret Hayes Williams' sister in Savannah. The letter addressed to Emma and Lily was simple and heartfelt, in Anne's joy at finding her brother's children, her sorrow for their suffering, her assurance that whatever they decided about their future, she would support them however they needed. Emma read it aloud to Lily that evening, her voice stumbling over the unfamiliar handwriting, but growing stronger with each line. When she finished, Lily asked the question that had clearly been weighing on both their minds. "Do we have to go to Georgia?" Carter, who had stayed for dinner at Samuel's invitation, answered gently. "No, Lily, your aunt understands that you found a home here with Dr. Thorne. She hopes to visit you someday, or perhaps have you visit her when you're older, but she doesn't want to disrupt your lives any further." The relief on both girls' faces was palpable. Samuel felt a weight lift from his own shoulders, one concern addressed at least. "What about Mrs. Reed?" Emma asked, her gaze direct. "Will she be at the hearing?" "Yes," Carter confirmed. "She'll present her case for having you return to the orphanage, and will present our case for Dr. Thorne's guardianship. Judge Howard will make the final decision." "Will we have to speak?" Emma's voice held a tremor she couldn't quite control. Carter glanced at Samuel before answering. "That will be up to the judge. If he asks you questions, you should answer truthfully. But you won't have to speak unless he specifically requests it." After the girls had gone to bed, Carter and Samuel sat by the fire glasses of whiskey in hand, discussing strategy for the hearing. "Victoria Reed has considerable influence in this town," Carter observed, "and Judge Howard seems firmly in her camp." "He is," Samuel confirmed grimly. "They share many of the same views about the war and its aftermath." Then we need to shift the focus away from old grudges and Confederate sympathies, Carter mused. Make it about the girls' welfare, their right to family connections, both with their aunt in Georgia and with you. Samuel hesitated, then reached into his pocket and withdrew Elizabeth's letter. There's something else you should see, he said, passing it to the attorney. Carter read it carefully, his expression growing increasingly grave. This changes everything, he said when he finished. If we can prove that William Hayes was working for the Union all along. The proof is at Shiloh, Samuel pointed out, hundreds of miles away, and we have less than 4 days before the hearing. Carter tapped the letter thoughtfully against his palm. Sometimes the threat of proof is as effective as the proof itself, he said. If we present this letter in court, indicate that we're prepared to retrieve the evidence if necessary. Victoria might back down rather than risk exposure. Samuel finished catching the attorney's line of thinking. Exactly, especially if we can find someone who might corroborate Elizabeth's claims about Colonel Reed's knowledge of Hayes' true role. Samuel's mind raced. Jacob Whitman, he said suddenly. He was a chaplain with Reed's regiment. If anyone might have heard Reed's confessions or confidences about Hayes, it would be Jacob. The Presbyterian minister, Carter clarified. Would he be willing to testify? I don't know, Samuel admitted. His position in the community is largely dependent on Victoria's goodwill. But Jacob is at heart a man of principle. If he knows something that could help the girls, it's worth asking, Carter agreed. First thing tomorrow. As the attorney prepared to leave, he paused at the door. You've created something remarkable here to Thorne, he said, glancing toward the loft where the girls slept. A family against all odds. Samuel followed his gaze, a warmth expanding in his chest that had nothing to do with whiskey or fire. They created it, he said softly. I just had the good sense to recognize it. Carter smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his professional demeanor. Either way, it's worth fighting for. I'll see you in court on Monday. After the attorney left, Samuel sat alone by the dying fire, Elizabeth's letter in his hands, thinking of the extraordinary chain of events that had led to this moment. William Hayes dying in a field hospital at Shiloh, entrusting his final message to a surgeon he barely knew. Elizabeth writing to that same surgeon years later, believing somehow that her daughters would find their way to him. And they had, through chance or fate, or what Hayes had called the poetry of God's will. Whatever forces had brought them together, Samuel was certain of one thing: he would not let them be separated now. Not by Victoria Reed, not by Judge Howard, not by anyone. With that resolution firm in his mind, he banked the fire and went to bed, sleeping soundly for the first time in days. Sunday morning dawned clear and warm, the kind of perfect spring day that seemed designed to lift spirits. Samuel helped the girls dress in their best clothes, the church dresses from Mrs. Henderson, hair neatly braided and tied with ribbons, and hitched the wagon for the trip to town. Do we have to go to church? Emma asked, her usual composure slipping to reveal the anxiety beneath. What if Mrs. Reed says something in front of everyone? She won't, Samuel assured her, though he wasn't entirely convinced himself. Sunday worship is sacred even to Victoria. Besides, it's important that people see us there as a family. It helps our case for tomorrow. Emma nodded, accepting this logic even as her small hands sought Lily's for reassurance. We'll be good, she promised. Extra quiet. You don't have to be extra anything, Samuel said gently, kneeling to her level. Just be yourselves. That's more than enough. The church was already filling when they arrived, families greeting each other in the spring sunshine before filing inside for the service. Samuel helped the girls down from the wagon, acutely aware of the glances cast their way, some curious, some friendly, some decidedly cool. Jacob met them at the door, resplendent in his Sunday vestments. Samuel, he greeted warmly. Emma, Lily, I'm so glad you could join us today. Samuel returned the greeting, then added in a lower voice, I need to speak with you after the service. It's important. Jacob's eyes sharpened with interest, but he merely nodded. Of course. Come to my study afterward. They found seats in the same pew as before, next to the Pemberton family. Mrs. Pemberton greeted the girls with genuine warmth, and her grandchildren particularly. Abigail seemed delighted to see them again. Samuel noted with approval how Lily's face brightened at Abigail's whispered welcome, her shyness momentarily forgotten. Victoria Reed sat in her customary place in the front pew, her back rigid, her black-clad figure a stark reminder of all that stood between them and security. She did not turn around as the congregation settled, but Samuel felt her awareness of their presence like a physical pressure in the air. The service proceeded with the usual rhythm of hymns, prayers, and scripture readings. Jacob's sermon on the theme of justice and mercy seemed particularly pointed, given the circumstances, though he made no direct reference to the hearing scheduled for the next day. "What does the Lord require of you?" he quoted from Micah, "but to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." These three commands form the foundation of righteous living. Justice without mercy becomes cruelty. Mercy without justice becomes permissiveness. And either without humility before God becomes self-righteousness, perhaps the most dangerous sin of all. Samuel glanced at Victoria during these words, wondering if she recognized herself in the description. Her profile remained impassive, giving no hint of her thoughts. As the congregation rose for the final hymn, Samuel felt a small hand slip into his. Looking down, he was surprised to find it was Lily, not Emma, who had reached for him. Her small face was upturned, a tentative smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Without thinking, he lifted her into his arms so she could see the hymnal better, her slight weight settling against his chest with natural ease. They sang together, Samuel's deep baritone blending with Lily's clear, sweet treble and Emma's careful alto. The simple act of making music together, their voices rising and falling in unison, felt profoundly intimate, a family united in something fundamental and pure. As the final notes faded and the congregation prepared to disperse, Samuel set Lily down, gently aware of eyes upon them. Looking up, he met Victoria Reed's gaze directly for the first time that day. She had turned in her pew, her dark eyes fixed on the tableau. They presented a man and two small girls holding hands, their faces still lifted in song. For a moment, something flashed in Victoria's expression, not the expected anger or disdain, but something more complex. Pain, perhaps, or recognition. Then it was gone, her features composing themselves into their familiar mask of stern righteousness. Samuel guided the girls outside, where they were immediately swept into conversation with the Pemberton grandchildren. Taking advantage of their distraction, he made his way to Jacob's study at the rear of the church, knocking once before entering. Jacob was removing his vestments, his expression questioning, as Samuel closed the door behind him. "What's so urgent, Sam? Something about tomorrow's hearing." "Yes." Samuel withdrew Elizabeth's letter from his pocket. "I need to know if this corresponds with anything you might have heard during the war, particularly from Colonel Reed." Jacob took the letter with a puzzled frown, which deepened as he read Elizabeth's words. When he finished, he looked up at Samuel, his face pale. "Where did you get this?" "Elizabeth Hayes left it with Ida Barnes before she died. Ida gave it to me yesterday." Samuel studied his friend's reaction closely. "Is it true Jacob was Hayes working for the Union all along?" Jacob sank into his chair, the letter trembling slightly in his hands. "I never knew for certain," he said slowly. "There were rumors, whispers about double agents in the regiment. Colonel Reed kept his intelligence operations very close, shared information only on a need-to-know basis." But, Jacob hesitated, clearly wrestling with himself. "After Antietam, when Reed was dying, he asked me to write letters for him, to his wife, to his brother in Boston. And in those letters, he mentioned regrets. Specifically, he regretted the sacrifice demanded by honor, his son's capture and death. And he asked me to tell Victoria that Hayes was not what she believed." "Did you deliver those messages?" Jacob nodded, his expression troubled. "I did. Victoria read them, then burned them before my eyes. She said grief had addled her husband's mind, that he wasn't thinking clearly at the end." "She chose to believe what she wanted to believe," Samuel observed grimly. "Yes." Jacob stood restlessly, pacing the small confines of his study. "Sam, if this is true, if Hayes was a Union operative and Reed knowingly sacrificed his own son to maintain that cover, it changes everything we thought we knew about those men. And it means Victoria's vendetta against Hayes's family has been based on a terrible misunderstanding." "Worse than that," Jacob said soberly. "It means she's refused to accept the truth even when confronted with it. That her hatred has become more important to her than her husband's final wishes." Samuel took back the letter, folding it carefully. "Will you testify to this at the hearing tomorrow?" Jacob stopped, pacing, his face a study in conflict. "You're asking me to publicly contradict Victoria Reed, the woman who chairs my church board, who contributes half the funds for our charitable works, who could essentially end my ministry in Cedar Creek with a word. I'm asking you to speak the truth, Samuel said quietly, for two innocent children who have suffered enough for conflicts that ended before they were born. Jacob was silent for a long moment, his internal struggle visible in the tension of his shoulders, the furrow of his brow. Finally, he sighed deeply. I'll pray about it, Sam. That's all I can promise right now. It wasn't the unequivocal support Samuel had hoped for, but it was honest. He nodded, accepting it for what it was. Thank you for considering it, he said, turning to leave. Sam, Jacob called as he reached the door. Whatever happens tomorrow, you've done right by those girls. Remember that? Outside, Samuel found Emma and Lily still chatting with the Pemberton children, their faces animated in a way he rarely saw outside the safety of their cabin. They looked up at his approach, both breaking into smiles that transformed their features, Lily's open and guileless, Emma's more measured but no less genuine. "Mr. Thorne," Lily called in excitement in her voice that was new and precious. "Abigail invited us for ice cream at her grandma's house. Can we go, please?" The simple childish request, so normal, so appropriate for their ages, struck Samuel with unexpected force. These were not just trauma survivors, not just legal challenges to be resolved. They were children who deserved ice cream, with friends, sunshine on spring afternoons, all the ordinary joys childhood should include. "Of course you can," he said, smiling at Mrs. Pemberton's approving nod. "I'll pick you up in an hour." As the girls went off hand in hand with their new friends, Samuel felt a presence at his elbow. He turned to find Ida Barnes watching him, her shrewd eyes missing nothing. "They're flourishing with you," she observed without preamble. "Anyone with the eyes can see it." "Thank you, Ida," Samuel replied, genuinely touched by her support. "That means a great deal coming from you." The old midwife snorted softly. "Don't thank me yet. Victoria's been working the crowd all morning, whispering about moral concerns and proper female influence. She's nothing if not thorough in her campaigns." Samuel glanced around, noting the small clusters of conversation the speculative glances cast his way. "Let her whisper," he said with more confidence than he felt. "The truth will speak louder." "I hope you're right." Ida patted his arm with gnarled fingers. "Martha would be proud of you, Samuel, for finding your way back to life through these children." The mention of his wife's name brought the familiar pang, but it was softer now, tempered by the new purpose that had entered his life. "I think she led them to me," he admitted quietly, "in a way I can't quite explain." Ida's eyes crinkled with understanding. "Love finds its channels, Samuel, even when we try to dam its flow." With that cryptic observation, she moved away, leaving Samuel to ponder her words as he watched the girls, his girls now in heart, if not yet in law, walking down the sunlit street with their friends, their small figures gradually receding from view, but never from his thoughts. Monday morning arrived with a tension that seeped into every moment of their usual routine. Samuel rose before dawn, unable to sleep as the hearing loomed. He found Emma already awake, sitting on the porch steps in her nightgown, watching the eastern sky lighten behind the pines. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, settling beside her. She shook her head. "Too much thinking." "About today?" "Mm-hmm." She drew her knees up to her chest, making herself smaller. "What if the judge doesn't believe us? What if he makes us go back?" Samuel chose his words carefully, balancing honesty with reassurance. "Mr. Carter is very good at his job. He has evidence that shows you belong with your family, both your aunt in Georgia and with me. And we have friends who will speak for us. Mrs. Barnes, Mrs. Pemberton, perhaps, Reverend Whitman. But Mrs. Reed has more friends," Emma pointed out with that disconcerting adult perception. "Important ones." "She has influence," Samuel acknowledged. "But we have truth on our side. That counts for a great deal in a court of law." Emma didn't look convinced, but she nodded, accepting his perspective. "Lily's still sleeping," she reported, changing the subject. "She didn't have any nightmares last night." "That's good," Samuel said, genuinely pleased. Lily's nightmares had been a near nightly occurrence when they first arrived, gradually decreasing in frequency as she settled into the safety of their new routine. "She likes it here," Emma continued, her voice taking on a protective edge. "She's happy." "I know," Samuel said gently, "and I'll do everything in my power to make sure she stays happy." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the sunrise paint the world in gold and rose. Finally, Emma spoke again, her voice so soft Samuel had to strain to hear it. "You make us happy too," she said. "Not just Lily, me too." Samuel felt something tighten in his chest. Not the familiar constriction of grief, but something warmer, fuller. "You both make me happy too," he replied, equally soft. "Happier than I've been in a very long time." Emma nodded, satisfied with this exchange of truths. "We should get ready," she said, practical as always. "We don't want to be late for court." The courthouse in Cedar Creek was a two-story brick building that dominated one side of the town square. Its columned entrance and formal facade gave it an imposing air designed to intimidate those who approached seeking justice or mercy. Samuel felt the weight of that intimidation as he helped the girls down from the wagon, noting how they both smoothed their dresses nervously, Emma in blue, Lily in yellow, their best clothes for this most important day. They had practiced how to address the judge, how to answer questions truthfully but briefly, how to conduct themselves with the dignity their young ages could manage. Daniel Carter waited for them at the courthouse steps, his formal attire and confident bearing a reassuring sight. "Good morning, Dr. Thorne, Emma, Lily." He bent slightly to the girl's level. "You both look very nice today." "Thank you, sir," Emma replied formally. Lily merely nodded her thumb, creeping toward her mouth before she caught herself and lowered her hand. "Are we ready?" Samuel asked, his voice steadier than he felt. Carter nodded. "As ready as we can be. Judge Howard has agreed to hear our petition for guardianship first, followed by Mrs. Reed's counterpetition. We'll present our evidence, she'll present hers, and then he'll make his determination." "And the girls?" "They'll sit with you initially. The judge may ask to speak with them privately in his chambers, which is standard in cases involving children." Emma's hand tightened in Samuel's at this information. "We won't be separated?" she asked, a tremor in her voice. "Only briefly, if at all," Carter assured her, "and only to answer the judge's questions without feeling pressured by anyone else's presence." This seemed to mollify Emma somewhat, though she still pressed closer to Samuel's side as they climbed the courthouse steps and entered the cool, echoing interior. The courtroom itself was on the first floor, its heavy oak doors standing open in anticipation of the day's proceedings. Inside the room was already half filled with spectators, a testament to the interest the case had generated in Cedar Creek. Samuel recognized faces from church, from town, even a few former patients he hadn't treated in years. Near the front sat Ida Barnes and Mrs. Pemberton, their presence a silent show of support. Jacob Whitman occupied a seat along the aisle, his expression troubled but resolute. And in the front row, directly behind the respondents' table, sat Victoria Reed, her black dress and severe posture as much a part of her identity as her unwavering convictions. Beside her was Henry Gladstone, Cedar Creek's most prominent attorney and a longtime ally of the Reed family. Samuel guided the girls to the petitioner's table where Carter had already arranged his documents. They sat together, a small island of tension amid the murmuring sea of spectators. Lily leaned against Samuel's arm, her small body radiating anxiety. Emma sat straight-backed beside her sister, her chin lifted in that familiar gesture of determination. At precisely 10 o'clock, the bailiff called for attention. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Howard." The room fell silent as Judge Howard entered from a side door, his black robes sweeping around him, his expression grave beneath bushy white eyebrows. He was in his 60s, with the weathered face of a man who had seen much of life's complexity and had settled on firm principles to navigate it. "Be seated," he instructed, taking his place at the bench. He surveyed the courtroom briefly, his gaze lingering on the two small girls at the petitioner's table before shifting to his docket. "We are here today to consider two petitions regarding the guardianship of Emma and Lily Hayes' minor children currently residing with Dr. Samuel Thorne. Mr. Carter, you may present your petition first." Carter rose smoothly, his manner respectful but confident. "Thank you, Your Honor. We are petitioning the court to grant permanent guardianship of Emma and Lily Hayes to Dr. Samuel Thorne, with the full support and consent of the children's nearest blood relative, their paternal aunt Margaret Hayes of Savannah, Georgia." He proceeded to outline the circumstances that had brought the girls into Samuel's care at the auction, the discovery of their connection to Lieutenant Hayes, the revelation of their aunt's existence, and her endorsement of the arrangement. He presented affidavits from Mrs. Barnes regarding Elizabeth Hayes's final wishes from Mrs. Pemberton, attesting to the girls' visible improvement under Samuel's care, and from the local school teacher who had assessed their educational progress. Throughout, Samuel was aware of Victoria Reed's unwavering stare, her rigid posture betraying nothing of her thoughts. Gladstone took copious notes, occasionally leaning to whisper something in Victoria's ear. When Carter concluded his initial presentation, Judge Howard turned his attention to the girls. Emma and Lily Hayes. He said, his voice gentler than it had been for the legal proceedings. Would you be willing to speak with me privately in my chambers, just for a few minutes? Emma glanced at Samuel, who nodded encouragingly. Yes, Your Honor, she replied, her voice small but clear in the hushed courtroom. Very good, Mrs. Finch will escort you. He gestured to a matronly woman who had been sitting near his bench. This won't take long, he assured Samuel, noting his concerned expression. As the girls followed Mrs. Finch through the side door, Samuel felt a momentary panic at letting them out of his sight. Carter placed a reassuring hand on his arm. It's standard procedure, he murmured. Judge Howard wants to hear their preferences without either party influencing them. Samuel nodded, forcing himself to remain calm. The courtroom waited in tense silence, the minutes stretching interminably. Finally, the side door opened, and the girls reappeared with Mrs. Finch. Both looked solemn but composed as they returned to their seats beside Samuel. Are you all right? He whispered as they settled back at the table. Emma nodded. He was nice, she whispered back. He asked if we were happy with you, and if we wanted to stay. And what did you say? A ghost of a smile touched Emma's lips. We said yes. Lily even showed him her doll that you bought her. Before Samuel could respond, Judge Howard called for attention. We will now hear Mrs. Reed's counter petition, he announced. Henry Gladstone rose with the confident air of a man accustomed to winning. Your Honor, my client, Mrs. Victoria Reed is petitioning for the Hayes children to be returned to the Hayes Orphan Asylum, where they can receive proper care and education in a structured environment with appropriate female influence. He proceeded to outline Victoria's concerns about Samuel's suitability as a guardian, his reclusive lifestyle, his lack of experience with children, his status as an unmarried man attempting to raise two young girls. He emphasized the respectable reputation of the Hayes Orphan Asylum and its successful placement of dozens of orphans in proper homes. Furthermore, Gladstone continued, his voice taking on a more somber tone. There is the matter of Dr. Thorne's connection to Lieutenant Hayes, the girl's father. By Dr. Thorne's own admission, he attended Lieutenant Hayes in his final hours at Shiloh. What he has not admitted is that he failed to deliver Hayes's final message to his wife, a failure that contributed directly to the unfortunate circumstances these children have endured. A murmur ran through the courtroom at this revelation. Samuel felt heat rise in his face, not from shame, but from anger at the deliberate mischaracterization of events. Mrs. Reed has only the children's best interests at heart, Gladstone concluded smoothly. She has devoted years to ensuring orphans like Emma and Lily receive proper care and moral guidance. To place them with a single man who has already failed their family once would be to compound the tragedy of their circumstances. Judge Howard nodded thoughtfully. Thank you, Mr. Gladstone. Mrs. Reed, do you wish to add anything to your attorney's statement? Victoria rose, her black dress rustling with the movement. Only this, Your Honor, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. These children deserve stability, proper feminine influence, and protection from those who might exploit their vulnerability. Dr. Thorne's sudden interest in two girls he had never met before the auction raises questions about his motivations that cannot be easily dismissed. The insinuation hung in the air, too vague to challenge directly, but clear enough in its implication. Samuel half rose from his seat, fury coursing through him at the veiled accusation, but Carter's restraining hand on his arm prevented him from speaking. Your Honor, Carter interjected smoothly, I must object to Mrs. Reed's characterization of Dr. Thorne's motives, which have been thoroughly documented in our petition and supported by multiple character witnesses. Judge Howard nodded. Objection sustained. Mrs. Reed, please confine your comments to factual matters. Victoria inclined her head in acknowledgement, though her expressions suggested she had achieved her purpose in planting the seed of doubt. Mr. Carter, your rebuttal, Judge Howard prompted. Carter rose again, his manner still composed despite the rising tension in the courtroom. Your Honor, I would like to present one final piece of evidence that directly addresses Mrs. Reed's concerns about Dr. Thorne's connection to Lieutenant Hayes. He withdrew Elizabeth's letter from his folder. This is a letter written by Elizabeth Hayes shortly before her death, addressed specifically to Dr. Thorne. In it, she confirms what Lieutenant Hayes himself believed, that his daughters would someday find their way to the doctor who attended him at Shiloh. Not through chance, but through what Hayes called the poetry of God's will. A stirring ran through the courtroom as Carter read portions of the letter aloud, carefully omitting the more sensitive revelations about William's role as a double agent and Colonel Reed's involvement in his son's capture. Even with these omissions, the letter painted a powerful picture of a mother's faith that her daughters would somehow find protection with the very doctor who had been with their father at the end. As Carter finished reading, Samuel became aware of movement in the back of the courtroom. Jacob Whitman had risen to his feet, his expression resolved despite the visible cost. "Your Honor," Jacob called, his voice carrying clearly in the hush room, "I asked permission to testify regarding matters directly relevant to this case." Judge Howard's bushy eyebrows rose in surprise. "Reverend Whitman, this is highly irregular. You were not called as a witness by either party." "Nevertheless, I have information that bears directly on the questions before this court," Jacob insisted. "Information I have kept silent about for too long." A murmur ran through the spectators. Victoria had half-turned in her seat, her expression a mixture of surprise and dawning alarm as she regarded the minister. Judge Howard considered for a moment, then nodded. "Very well, Reverend. Please approach the bench and state your piece." Jacob moved forward, his clerical collar stark against his black coat, his steps measured but determined. As he passed Victoria's seat, she reached out as if to stop him, but he continued past, his gaze fixed on the judge. "Your Honor," Jacob began, his voice steady despite the tension visible in his bearing, "I served as chaplain to Colonel Reed's regiment during the war. I was with him at Antietam when he received his mortal wound, and I wrote his final letters at his dictation." Victoria had gone very still, her face pale beneath its usual composure. "In those letters," Jacob continued, "Colonel Reed expressed regret for what he called the sacrifice demanded by honor, his son's capture and subsequent death at Antietam. He specifically instructed me to tell Mrs. Reed that Hayes was not what she believed. I delivered those messages faithfully, though Mrs. Reed chose to disregard them as the ramblings of a dying man." The courtroom had gone absolutely silent, every eye fixed on the minister as he continued. "I have remained silent about these matters out of respect for Mrs. Reed's grief and position in our community. But I can no longer stand by while two innocent children suffer for misunderstandings that should have been corrected years ago." Jacob turned slightly, addressing Victoria directly now. "Mrs. Reed, Colonel Reed knew that Lieutenant Hayes was working for the Union as a double agent. The information Hayes passed to Confederate contacts was deliberately falsified, designed to mislead the enemy. Your son's capture was not the result of Hayes's betrayal, but a calculated risk in a larger strategy approved by Colonel Reed himself." Victoria's face had drained of all color, her hands gripping the rail before her so tightly that her knuckles showed white. "You lie," she whispered, but the words lacked conviction. "I do not," Jacob replied gently. "Your husband tried to tell you the truth before he died. You chose not to hear it then. I pray you will hear it now before more damage is done to these children who have already lost so much." He turned back to Judge Howard. "Your Honor, I believe Dr. Thorne's guardianship of Emma and Lily Hayes represents not just the best outcome for these children, but a kind of divine justice, a completion of a circle broken 15 years ago when Lieutenant Hayes died at Shiloh. Dr. Thorne couldn't deliver Hayes's final message then, but he can fulfill its spirit now by giving these children the home and protection their father would have wanted for them." A long silence followed Jacob's testimony. Judge Howard studied the minister thoughtfully, then shifted his gaze to Victoria, who sat rigid with shock, and finally to Samuel, and the girls who had listened to the entire exchange with solemn attention. "This has been most illuminating," Judge Howard said at last. "I believe I have sufficient information to make my determination." He shuffled the papers before him, then looked up, his gaze sweeping the courtroom before settling on Samuel. "Dr. Thorne, please stand, Emma and Lily as well." Samuel rose, the girls following his example, Emma's hand finding his, Lily pressing close to his other side. "It is the finding of this court that the best interests of Emma and Lily Hayes will be served by granting permanent guardianship to Dr. Samuel Thorne with the consent and cooperation of their Aunt Margaret Hayes of Savannah." Judge Howard's voice was firm and clear, leaving no room for argument. "Furthermore, the court directs that a full accounting be made of the Hayes Trust Fund with all misappropriated funds to be restored to the girls' benefit under the supervision of Mr. Carter and a court-appointed trustee. He turned his attention to Victoria, who had not moved since Jacob's revelation. Mrs. Reed, the court recognizes that your actions, however misguided, were motivated by grief and a misunderstanding of complex wartime circumstances. No criminal charges will be pursued provided you cooperate fully with the accounting of the Hayes Trust and cease all attempts to interfere with Dr. Thorne's guardianship. Victoria gave no sign of having heard him, her gaze fixed on some middle distance, her face a mask of shock and dawning comprehension. This court is adjourned, Judge Howard concluded, bringing down his gavel with a sharp crack that echoed through the stunned silence. For a moment, no one moved. Then Emma turned to Samuel, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Does this mean—" she began, unable to complete the question. Samuel knelt to the girl's level, his heart too full for words. "It means you're staying with me," he said softly. "For good. We're a family now." Lily's face broke into a radiant smile, and without warning, she threw her small arms around Samuel's neck. "Papa," she whispered against his ear, the word both a christening and a benediction. Emma joined the embrace more cautiously but with equal fervor. Over the girl's shoulders, Samuel met Jacob's gaze across the courtroom. The minister nodded once, a gesture of blessing and acknowledgement, before turning to where Victoria still sat motionless in her shock. As the courtroom began to empty, well-wishers approaching to congratulate them, Samuel held his girls close, marveling at the strange winding path that had brought them to this moment. William Hayes's daughters found at last. Martha's eyes living on in a child who needed him. A family created not from blood, but from choice, from need, from love, that had found its channel despite all attempts to dam its flow. Outside, spring sunlight bathed the courthouse steps in gold. Samuel led the girls into that light, their small hands warm in his, their futures unfolding before them, like the dusty road that would carry them home, not to a cabin haunted by grief and solitude, but to a home made whole by their presence. And somewhere perhaps William and Elizabeth Hayes looked down on their daughters with peace, at last knowing that the circle had been completed. The promise fulfilled, the whispers from a long ago dusty road finally heard and answered.